They say an alpha without fear is unstoppable. King Darius Vane proved that for 30 years, until the night an Omega Queen walked into his throne room and smiled like she already owned it. No trembling, no submission, just those cold green eyes asking one simple question. What happens when the monster finally meets someone who refuses to run? If you want to see how an empire built on terror crumbles in front of one woman who won't kneel, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is watching. The throne room of the Iron Moon Empire smelled like old blood and newer lies. Darius Vane sat motionless on a seat carved from blackwood and wolfbone, watching two nobles tear each other apart with words sharp enough to draw real wounds. The marble floor beneath their expensive boots had witnessed 3 centuries of arguments just like this one. Territory disputes. Bloodline challenges. The endless squabbling of men who thought themselves powerful because they controlled land their grandfathers had stolen. He let them fight, let them think their voices mattered. Alpha Lord Garrett from the Northern Reach was red-faced now, spittle flying as he jabbed a finger toward his rival. You crossed into my hunting grounds. My wolves marked those trees 50 years before your father was born. Alpha Lord Corvus sneered back, arms crossed over a chest thick with old battle scars. Your wolves mark everything from here to the frozen wastes. Doesn't make it yours. Doesn't make it sacred. Darius said nothing, just watched with eyes the color of winter iron, the kind of gray that made men remember why wolves were never truly domesticated. His fingers drummed once against the armrest, a sound like knuckles on a coffin lid. Both alphas went silent. That was the thing about absolute power. You didn't need to shout, you didn't need to threaten. You just needed to exist in a room and let every man remember what you'd done to the last fool who forgot his place. Darius stood, 6 feet 4 inches of controlled violence wrapped in black leather and ceremonial armor that had been forged before most of these nobles were born. His dark hair was pulled back tight, showing the brutal angles of a face that had never needed to smile to get what it wanted. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw looked like something that should have killed him. It hadn't. The man who gave it to him had died screaming. He descended the 7 steps from throne to floor with the measured pace of something that didn't hurry because nothing in this world could outrun it anyway. Lord Garrett dropped to one knee immediately. Corvus followed half a second later, which meant Corvus was already dead and just didn't know it yet. Your Majesty, Garrett said, voice stripped of its earlier fury. We seek only your wisdom in— I don't care. Darius stopped 3 feet away, close enough that both men could smell the leather and weapon oil and something else underneath. Something that whispered of hunt and hunger, and a wildness that civilization had never quite managed to cage. Your territories will be surveyed again. New markers will be placed. If either of you crosses them, I'll burn both your estates to ash and give the land to farmers. But Your Majesty, the bloodline rights, are worth exactly what I say they're worth. Darius let the words hang there like a noose. Now get out of my sight before I remember that your grandfather tried to poison mine, Garrett. The blood drained from Lord Garrett's face. That was 70 years ago. That debt was paid. Debts are never paid. They're just forgotten until someone like me decides to remember. Darius smiled then, showing teeth. Now. Out. They scrambled toward the massive oak doors like rabbits who just realized they were dining with a wolf. The throne room emptied in seconds, leaving only Darius and his commander of the guard, a grizzled alpha named Thane, who'd been breaking bones in the king's service since before Darius took the crown. Thane waited until the doors closed. You didn't need to threaten Garrett. He was already backing down. I know. Darius walked to the eastern window, staring out at the sprawling capital city below. Stone buildings packed tight as teeth, smoke rising from 10,000 chimneys, the markets churning with life and commerce, and the kind of desperate energy that came from people who lived under the shadow of something they couldn't control. That's why I did it. Fear is like a muscle, Thane. If you don't exercise it regularly, it gets weak. Thane grunted. Philosophical today. I'm philosophical every day. You just don't listen. Darius turned back from the window. What's the report from the Eastern Territories? Quiet. Too quiet. Thane moved closer, voice dropping. Your spies say the Omega settlements have been organizing. Nothing violent. Just talking. Meeting. sharing resources without going through proper channels. Let them talk. Darius returned to his throne, settling into it like a man who'd worn the same chair so long it had molded to his shape. Omegas organized like mice build nests. Lots of noise, no real structure. They'll squabble among themselves and fall apart by winter. Maybe. Thane didn't sound convinced. But there's something else. The peace summit next week. We've received confirmation from all the major pacts except one. Which one? The Vale territory. Darius went very still. The Vale territory was a ghost story, a stretch of unclaimed land in the western mountains that no Alpha had ever successfully conquered. Too remote, too defensible, too poor to bother with. For 200 years it had existed in a kind of negotiated silence, neither part of the empire nor fully independent, a place where wolves went when they wanted to disappear. The Vale doesn't send representatives, Darius said slowly. They don't acknowledge the empire's authority. They're sending one this year. Thane pulled a sealed letter from his coat, crossing to hand it to the king. Arrived this morning, signed by someone calling herself Omega Queen Lyra Vale. Darius broke the seal. The handwriting was neat, controlled, utterly lacking the flowery deference that usually marked correspondence from lesser territories. It read like a business transaction. King Vane, I will attend your summit as representative of the Vale territory. I expect the same courtesies extended to your other guests. I will arrive on the first night with a retinue of 6. We will require no special accommodations. We will stay 3 days. We will speak truths you may not wish to hear. Respectfully, Lyra Vale. Darius read it twice, then he started laughing. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of a man who'd just been handed something he didn't understand, and Darius Vane had spent 3 decades making sure he understood everything. She's insane, he said flatly. Possibly. Thane scratched his jaw. Or incredibly brave. There's no difference. Darius tossed the letter onto a side table. Fine. Let her come. Let this Omega Queen from nowhere stand in a room full of alphas who've crushed rebellions and conquered territories and built empires from blood, and see how long her courage lasts. You want me to prepare extra security? No. Darius leaned back, fingers steepled. I want you to prepare nothing. Treat her exactly like every other minor representative. No special guards. No separate quarters. Put her in the guest wing with everyone else, and let's see if the mystery woman from the mountains knows how to play politics with the wolves who wrote the rules. Thane nodded slowly. As you command, Your Majesty. When he was alone again, Darius picked up the letter, studied the handwriting. There was something in those clean, controlled lines that bothered him. No fear, no manipulation. Just simple declarative sentences that stated facts and made no apologies. Women like that were dangerous. Not because they had power, but because they didn't act like they needed permission to exist. He'd met dangerous women before. He'd married one decades ago, an alpha female from a rival pack who'd tried to poison him on their wedding night. She'd died badly. He'd met rebel leaders and spy mistresses and warrior queens who thought sharpened steel and righteous anger could change the world. They'd all learned the same lesson eventually. The world didn't change. It just found new ways to stay the same. But something about this letter felt different. Like a challenge delivered so quietly, you almost missed the knife hidden in the words. We will speak truths you may not wish to hear. Darius smiled, set the letter on fire with a candle flame, and watched it curl into ash. Bring your truths, Omega Queen, he murmured to the empty throne room. Let's see how they taste when I feed them back to you. The summit began on a cold night when the moon hung fat and silver over the Iron Moon capital, like a judge taking her seat. The great hall had been prepared for war disguised as diplomacy. Long tables arranged in a half-circle facing the king's seat. Banners from 24 territories hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Servants moving between guests with wine and roasted meat, while guards in ceremonial armor stood at every entrance, hands never far from their weapons. Darius watched them arrive from his position at the head table. Alpha Lord Marcus from the southern plains, built like a bear and twice as mean. Lady Kira from the coastal reach, who drowned her own brother to claim her pack. The twins from the eastern range, who finished each other's sentences and each other's enemies. Representatives from territories so small they barely registered on maps, all desperate to be seen, to matter, to carve out one more inch of relevance in an empire that ground up the weak and fed them to the strong. They all bowed to him. They all smiled. They all hated him with the kind of hatred that comes from knowing you'll never be brave enough to do anything about it. Darius had been receiving that particular brand of hatred for so long it felt like affection. The hall filled. Conversations rose and fell like waves. Politics conducted in whispers and sideways glances. Old alliances being tested. New ones being forged in the spaces between words. Then the great doors opened one final time and the room went quiet. She walked in like she owned the silence. Lyra Vale was not what Darius expected. She wasn't a warrior queen in battle-scarred armor or a seductive manipulator draped in silk and promises. She wore a simple traveling cloak over dark clothing that looked designed for function, not ceremony. Her hair was black as old iron, pulled back in a practical braid that fell past her shoulders. She was maybe 5'6", slim but not fragile, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd walked through harder places than this and survived. But it was her face that caught him. She was beautiful in the way a winter morning was beautiful. Clear, cold, absolutely unimpressed by anything that tried to pretend it mattered more than survival. Her eyes were green like deep forests where predators waited, and when she looked directly at Darius, she didn't lower her gaze. She smiled. Not a submissive smile, not a seductive smile. Just a small, knowing curve of lips that said, "I see exactly what you are, and I'm not impressed." Behind her came 6 others. 5 looked like guards, scarred and silent and watching every corner of the room. The 6th was an older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in the simple robes of an advisor. Lyra Vale approached the head table without hesitation. The crowd parted for her, not out of respect, out of sheer confusion. Omegas didn't walk like that. They deferred. They submitted. They understood their place in the order of things. This woman walked like she'd forgotten to read the manual on how to be afraid. She stopped 10 feet from Darius and offered the smallest inclination of her head. "King Vane, thank you for the invitation." Her voice was low, controlled, carrying easily across the silent hall. It had an accent he couldn't quite place, something from the deep mountains maybe, where people still spoke the old words. "I don't recall extending a personal invitation," Darius said mildly. "You invited yourself. Then I appreciate you not rescinding it." Lyra gestured to her retinue. "My guards and my advisor, Clara, will require no special arrangements, just a place to sit and permission to speak when the time comes. Bold words for someone from a territory that doesn't officially exist. The Vale exists. You've simply chosen not to acknowledge it." She met his eyes again. "That doesn't make it less real. Just less convenient for your maps." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled nobles. "You didn't talk to the Iron King like that. You didn't correct him. You didn't smile while doing it." Darius felt something strange stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Interest. "You have a seat at the far table," he said, gesturing to the arrangement where minor territories were placed, "with the other representatives of your stature." "How generous." Lyra didn't move. "Though I notice you've placed the smallest territories farthest from your voice. Does that mean you don't want to hear what they have to say, or that you're afraid you might have to listen?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alpha Lord Marcus rose from his seat, face already red. "You dare!" "Sit down, Marcus." Darius didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Marcus sat. The king studied Lyra for a long moment, weighing options, calculating angles. "You came here to make a scene. I came here to attend a summit." Lyra's expression didn't change. "If my presence makes a scene, perhaps that says more about the summit than it does about me." "Fair enough." Darius gestured to an empty chair 3 seats down from his own position, in the section reserved for major pack leaders. "You'll sit here. Close enough to speak. Close enough for everyone to hear whatever truths you think we're not ready for." The hall erupted in whispers. Thane moved closer to the throne, hand on his sword, but Darius waved him back. Lyra considered the offer for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked to the indicated seat and sat down with the easy grace of someone who'd expected nothing less. Her guards positioned themselves along the wall. Her advisor took a seat beside her. And the entire hall stared at the Omega Queen from nowhere, who'd just been seated among wolves who'd spent lifetimes learning how to kill. Darius raised his goblet. Let the summit begin. The first 2 hours were standard political theater. Territory disputes, trade agreements, complaints about border raids and requests for imperial mediation. Darius listened with half his attention, dispensing judgment with the casual efficiency of someone who'd settled 10,000 arguments exactly like these. But his eyes kept drifting to Lyra Vale. She sat quietly through most of it, watching, listening, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to her advisor. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just observed with those forest green eyes that seemed to see past the performance into the machinery underneath. When Alpha Lord Theron from the Western Ridge began complaining about Omega labor shortages affecting his territory's mining operations, something shifted in Lyra's expression. The issue, Theron was saying, is that Omegas are refusing assignment to the deep mines. They claim the conditions are unsafe. They're demanding better wages, shorter hours, all manner of ridiculous accommodations that— Have you been to the deep mines? Lyra's voice cut through Theron's speech like a blade through silk. The hall went quiet again. Theron turned to stare at her. Excuse me? The deep mines in the Western Ridge. Have you personally inspected them? Theron's face darkened. I don't need to personally inspect them. I have overseers for— So you haven't. Lyra leaned forward slightly. I have. 3 months ago, I walked through those mines with a group from the Vale who were considering contract work in your territory. The tunnels flood every spring. The support beams are rotted. The air is so thick with dust that men cough blood after 6-month rotations. You're not experiencing a labor shortage, Lord Theron. You're experiencing a survival instinct. How dare you? Theron sputtered. You have no authority to— I have the authority of having actually seen the conditions you're too comfortable to witness yourself. Lyra's voice remained calm, but something sharp glinted underneath. Your Omegas aren't refusing work. They're refusing to die for wages that won't even cover their family's needs after they're gone. Darius watched this exchange with growing fascination. Around the table, other nobles shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerous territory. Class tensions, labor disputes, the kind of conversation that polite society acknowledged existed but never discussed directly. Lord Theron, Darius said slowly, when did you last tour the mining facilities? Theron swallowed. My overseers provide regular reports. That's not an answer. The Western Ridge Alpha looked trapped. 2 years ago, Your Majesty. But I received detailed— 2 years. Darius let that hang in the air, and in that time, how many workers have died in those mines? Theron's face went pale. The reports mentioned some accidents, but accidents are inevitable in— How many? The silence was absolute. Theron looked down at his hands. 47, Your Majesty. 47 workers, Darius repeated softly, and you wonder why the survivors don't want to follow them into the dark. He turned to Lyra. You said you toured these mines. What did you recommend to the families who were considering the work? I told them the truth. Lyra met his gaze without flinching. That Lord Theron values the ore more than the people who dig it. That they should demand triple wages and half shifts or refuse the work entirely. That no amount of silver is worth suffocating in a collapsing tunnel while your family waits for a body that will never come home whole. A shocked murmur ran through the assembled nobles. This was beyond bold. This was sedition. Encouraging workers to refuse assigned labor, demanding wages above imperial guidelines. Alpha Lady Kira leaned forward. You're advocating for disobedience against rightful pack authority. I'm advocating for survival. Lyra turned to face her. But I understand how those might look similar from where you're sitting. Kira's hand slammed the table. You forget your place, Omega. No. Lyra's voice went very quiet. Very cold. I know exactly what my place is. The question is whether you know what yours should be. The hall erupted, voices shouting over voices, accusations flying. Thane moved toward Lyra's position, but Darius raised one hand and every guard in the room froze. The Iron King stood. The hall went silent, like someone had cut every throat at once. Darius walked around the head table, descending to floor level, moving with that same unhurried predator's pace. He stopped directly in front of Lyra Vale. She didn't stand, didn't bow, just tilted her head back to maintain eye contact and waited. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, Darius said softly, or the stupidest. Maybe both. Lyra smiled that small, knowing smile again. Does it matter which? It matters if you want to leave this summit alive. If you were going to kill me for speaking, you would have done it already. She gestured at the other nobles. You want them to see what happens when someone challenges the system. But you're curious. You want to know if I'm really foolish enough to push further, or if I'll break and apologize and prove that the old order still holds? And what do you think you'll do? I think I'll keep speaking truths until you either silence me or acknowledge them. Lyra's eyes never left his. Because I didn't come here to play politics, King Vane. I came here to break something. The room held its breath. Darius stared at her for 5 seconds that stretched into eternity. Then he started laughing. It was a real laugh this time. Not the cruel sound from earlier, something genuine and surprised and almost pleased. You came to break something, he repeated. Do you have any idea how many people have tried to break this empire? Thousands, probably. Lyra remained seated, perfectly calm. But they tried to break it from the outside. I'm going to break it from the inside. How very ambitious. Darius leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with hers. And what makes you think I'll let you? Because you're bored, she said simply. You've been sitting on that throne for 30 years, ruling an empire built by your grandfather, refined by your father, and perfected by you. You've crushed every rebellion, conquered every territory, broken every challenge, and now you sit in this hall night after night listening to men argue about borders and mines and bloodlines, and you're dying of boredom. I'm not bored, Darius said softly. I'm efficient. You're both, Lyra smiled. And that's why you seated me close to you instead of far away. That's why you're still listening instead of having your guards drag me out. Because for the first time in years, someone walked into your throne room who isn't afraid of you, and you don't know what to do with that. The words hit like arrows, finding gaps in armor. Darius straightened, returned to his seat. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire hall. The summit will continue tomorrow night. We will reconvene at sunset to discuss trade regulations. He paused, eyes finding Lyra's across the distance. And our guest from the Vale will be given time to present her observations about the state of the Empire. Uninterrupted. Another wave of shocked whispers. Thane looked like he wanted to object, but knew better. Darius raised his goblet again. Dismissed. The hall emptied slowly, nobles casting sidelong glances at Lyra as they filed out. She remained seated until the room was nearly clear, then rose with that same unhurried grace. She walked toward the exit, paused at the doorway, turned back to look at Darius one final time. Thank you for the interesting evening, Your Majesty. Then she was gone, guards following, leaving Darius alone in the great hall with his commander, and the lingering scent of something that felt dangerously like respect. Thane approached slowly. That was unexpected, Darius finished. He was still staring at the doorway where she'd disappeared. She's going to be a problem. Should I increase security around her quarters? No. Darius finally pulled his gaze away. I want her watched, but subtly. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to. But don't interfere. Don't intimidate. Just observe. You want to know what she's really doing here. I want to know how she stays so calm in a room full of predators. Darius stood, walking to the same eastern window he'd stood at days before. She's not stupid, Thane. Everything she did tonight was calculated. The challenges, the defiance. Even the way she sat down when I offered that chair. She knew exactly what she was doing. Which was what? Making me curious. Darius's reflection smiled in the window glass. And curiosity is the first crack in any armor. You sound impressed. I am. Darius turned away from the city lights. I'm also suspicious. Women like that don't appear from nowhere without a reason. Find out everything you can about the Vale territory. Who leads it, how they survive, why they've stayed hidden for 200 years. And find out who Lyra Vale really is. You think she's lying about her identity? I think she's telling the truth in a way that hides something bigger. Darius headed toward his private chambers, which makes her either a master manipulator or genuinely dangerous. And if she's both, then tomorrow night is going to be very interesting. Cool. Lyra's quarters in the guest wing were modest. A bedroom, a sitting room, and a small balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. The furnishings were expensive but impersonal. The kind of luxury that said, you're important enough to house well, but not important enough to matter. She stood on the balcony now, looking out at the capital spread below. Clara, her advisor, joined her with 2 cups of tea. That was reckless, the older woman said quietly. That was necessary. Lyra accepted the tea. We had one chance to establish ourselves as something other than supplicants. If I'd bowed and scraped like the others, We would have been dismissed before the summit even began. You made enemies tonight, powerful ones. I made them notice me. Lyra sipped the tea. There's a difference. Enemies can be dealt with. Being ignored is fatal. Clara studied her for a long moment. You challenged the king directly, in front of his entire court. Most people don't survive that. Most people don't understand him. Lyra's eyes remained on the city. Darius Vane has spent 30 years being feared. He's perfected it. But fear is a blunt instrument. It works on people who have something to lose. We don't. Everyone has something to lose. Not us. Not anymore. Lyra's voice went soft. We lost everything when the Empire's expansion killed our villages and scattered our people. We lost our families when the noble pacts decided Omega lives were worth less than mining profits. What's he going to threaten me with? Death? I've been living in the shadow of that since I was 15. Clara set down her teacup. So this is revenge? No. Lyra turned to face her. This is revolution. But it has to look like conversation first. And you think he'll allow it? I think he's smart enough to recognize that the Empire is breaking from the inside. The noble bloodlines are corrupt. The territories are restless. The common wolves are realizing that the system doesn't serve them anymore. Darius can feel it. He's just been too successful to admit it needs to change, so you're going to force him to admit it. I'm going to make him choose. Lyra's eyes glinted. Between preserving a dying system or rebuilding something new. Between fear and loyalty. Between being remembered as a tyrant or a reformer. That's ambitious. That's survival. Lyra returned her gaze to the city. Because the Empire is going to fall eventually. The only question is whether it falls into chaos or transformation. I prefer transformation. And if Darius chooses chaos, then we'll make sure the Veil survives what comes next. Lyra's jaw tightened. But I don't think he will. He's brutal, yes. Ruthless, absolutely. But he's not stupid. And stupid is the only thing that would make him think he can hold this empire together with fear alone for much longer. A sound from inside the quarters. One of the guards stepping into view. My lady. We've swept the rooms, no surveillance devices, no hidden passages, but there are guards watching the corridor. Expected, Lyra said. Make sure our people get rest. Tomorrow night will be longer. The guard nodded and withdrew. Clara remained on the balcony. You're planning something for tomorrow's speech. I'm planning to expose the corruption that's rotting the noble bloodlines from the inside. Lyra's voice was matter-of-fact. Starting with the council members who've been manipulating territory disputes to maintain their own power base. You have proof? I have names. Dates? Witnesses who are willing to speak if given protection. She turned to Clara. The question isn't whether I can prove it. The question is whether Darius will allow me to present that proof in front of the entire summit, or whether he'll shut me down to protect his nobles. And if he shuts you down, then we'll know exactly where he stands. Lyra smiled that cold smile again, and we'll adjust our strategy accordingly. You mean we'll leave? I mean we'll fight. Lyra's eyes hardened. Because I didn't come here to negotiate peace with a broken system, Clara. I came here to break the system itself. And if Darius Vane wants to stand in the way of that, he'll learn the same lesson every other tyrant learns eventually. Which is, that power built on fear only lasts as long as people are too afraid to imagine something different. Lyra looked out at the sleeping city. And we're done being afraid. Quiet. Darius didn't sleep well. He lay in his private chambers staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's events. The way Lyra Vale had walked into his hall like she had every right to be there. The way she'd challenged Theron without raising her voice. The way she'd looked at him when she said, "You're bored." She was wrong about that. He wasn't bored. He was... Darius closed his eyes. Fine. Maybe she was right about that. 3 decades of absolute power had a way of making everything feel predictable. The nobles always schemed. The territories always rebelled. The people always submitted, eventually. It was a cycle he'd learned to navigate with brutal efficiency. But Lyra Vale didn't fit the cycle. She wasn't a schemer. Those he could spot instantly. She wasn't a rebel leader. Those always reeked of desperation. She was something else entirely. Something that felt like a rock in smooth water. Not causing waves, just existing in a way that changed the current around it. Dangerous. Darius rose from bed and walked to his private study. On the desk sat reports from his spies. information gathered about the Vale territory over the past 2 days since they'd received Lyra's letter. The reports were frustratingly thin. The Vale territory occupied a stretch of mountains in the western frontier. Population estimated at 5,000. No formal government structure that Imperial scouts could identify. Resources limited to hunting, small-scale farming, and some mining. No standing army, no fortifications, just scattered communities that seemed to operate through some kind of informal council system. They should have been easy to conquer. Any competent alpha with 100 soldiers could have taken the territory in a week. But no one ever had, because the Vale had something every conqueror eventually learned to respect: perfect knowledge of their own terrain. The mountain passes were death traps if you didn't know the safe routes. The valleys flooded in spring. The winters killed unprepared troops. And the people themselves had a reputation for vanishing into the landscape like smoke when threatened. They didn't fight. They disappeared. And when the invading force finally gave up and retreated, the Vale communities simply reappeared and continued existing. For 200 years, the Empire had treated them as irrelevant, too poor to tax, too scattered to conscript, too remote to bother controlling. But now their Omega Queen sat in Darius's hall calling his nobles liars to their faces. He picked up another report, this one about Lyra Vale specifically. Age: estimated late 20s. Parents: unknown. Background: emerged as a community leader in the Vale approximately 8 years ago. Known for organizing mutual aid networks, negotiating disputes between Vale communities, and occasionally leading small groups into Imperial territories to gather information or recruit displaced Omegas. No violent incidents on record, no criminal activity, no connection to any known rebel groups. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be: a community organizer who'd somehow convinced scattered mountain villages to unify under her leadership, which made no sense. Leaders required power, military strength or wealth or bloodline authority or some combination of all three. Lyra Vale had none of those things, yet she commanded loyalty from people who'd spent centuries refusing to acknowledge any central authority. How? Darius stared at the reports until the words blurred. Then he did something he rarely did. He admitted he didn't understand. That admission sat in his chest like a stone. Darius Vane didn't do uncertainty. He did calculation and action and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment to achieve exactly the desired result. But Lyra Vale was a variable he couldn't quite solve. Tomorrow night she would speak, would present her observations about the state of the Empire, and Darius had promised she could do so uninterrupted. He was starting to suspect that was a mistake, not because she was dangerous in the traditional sense, but because she was dangerous in a way he hadn't encountered before. She wasn't trying to take his power. She was trying to make him question whether that power meant what he thought it meant, and questions were more dangerous than swords. The second night of the summit arrived with gathering storm clouds. The great hall filled again. The same nobles, the same guards, the same careful arrangement of power and protocol, but the atmosphere was different now. Electric. Everyone waiting to see what the Omega Queen would do next. Lyra arrived with her retinue exactly at sunset. Same simple clothing, same calm expression. She took her seat without ceremony and waited. Darius let the preliminaries drag on longer than necessary. Territory reports, trade agreements, minor disputes that could have been solved by any competent administrator. He watched Lyra from the corner of his eye, waiting for impatience or frustration. She showed neither, just waited with the patience of someone who understood that waiting itself could be a weapon. Finally, when the moon had risen high enough to shine through the eastern windows, Darius stood. Our guest from the Vale territory has requested time to address the summit. He looked directly at Lyra. The floor is yours, Queen Vale. Speak your truth. Lyra rose, stepped out from behind the table into the open space before the assembly. For a moment she just stood there, letting every eye in the room focus on her. Then she began. I want to tell you a story about wolves. Her voice carried easily across the hall. Not loud, just clear. Once there was a great pack that controlled every hunting ground from the mountains to the sea. The pack was led by the strongest alphas, the ones who'd proven themselves in combat and conquest. And for generations, the pack thrived. They had structure, order, success. She walked slowly as she spoke, hands clasped behind her back. But over time, something changed. The alphas at the top became so focused on maintaining their position that they forgot why the pack existed in the first place. They started making decisions that benefited the leaders but harmed the hunters. They claimed the best kills for themselves and left the scraps for everyone else. They told the pack this was natural. This was the order of things. This was how survival worked. A few of the assembled nobles shifted uncomfortably. The betas saw what was happening but stayed quiet because they hoped to become alphas themselves someday. The omegas saw it too but stayed silent because they'd been taught that speaking against the strong meant death, and so the rot spread. Year after year, generation after generation. Until one day, a young wolf looked around and asked a simple question. Lyra stopped walking, turned to face the entire assembly. Why are we protecting a system that only protects those at the top? The silence was absolute. She smiled. That's not a children's story. That's happening right now, in this empire, in this hall. You all know it. You've just been pretending not to see it because acknowledging the rot means admitting you've been part of creating it. Alpha Lord Marcus rose from his seat, face dark with anger. This is sedition. Your Majesty, are you going to allow— Sit down, Darius said quietly. She was promised uninterrupted time. She has it. Marcus sat slowly, fury radiating from him like heat. Lyra continued, Let me be specific. Over the past 5 years, territorial disputes in the western provinces have increased by 40%. The Imperial Court has mediated 37 major conflicts in that region. Do you know what I discovered when I examined those cases? She pulled a folded paper from her coat. Read from it in that same calm voice. 33 of those 37 disputes were initiated by complaints filed by nobles on the Imperial Council, the same council that mediates the disputes, the same council that profits from the new border arrangements after each mediation. They create the conflicts they're paid to resolve. Shock rippled through the hall like lightning. That's a lie, someone shouted from the back. Is it? Lyra looked up from the paper. Lord Corvus, you filed a border complaint against the Southern Reach 3 years ago claiming their hunting parties crossed into your territory. The case was mediated by Chancellor Aldrich, who ruled in your favor and redrew the borders. 1 month later, your son married Chancellor Aldrich's daughter. And somehow those new borders placed valuable iron deposits in your territory that had previously been neutral ground. Lord Corvus had gone white. Lady Kira, Lyra continued, turning to face the coastal alpha, you filed 7 disputes in 2 years. 6 were mediated by Councillor Thorne. Your pack now controls 3 of the major port cities that used to be independent territories. And Councillor Thorne owns merchant vessels that operate exclusively out of those ports. Quite the coincidence. This is slander, Kira hissed. You have no proof. I have testimony from 43 witnesses. Lyra's voice cut like ice. Displaced families, ruined packs, omegas who lost everything when their territories were carved up by nobles who turned border disputes into profit margins. They're waiting outside this hall right now. Do you want me to bring them in? The room erupted. Nobles shouting, guards moving toward Lyra, Clara and the Veil Guard stepping forward to protect her. Darius sat motionless on his throne, watching it all unfold. He'd suspected some of this, had known his council was corrupt, but he'd allowed it because corrupt nobles were predictable nobles. They had something to lose, which made them controllable. But Lyra Vale was threatening to burn that entire system to ash. And the terrifying thing was, she had the proof to do it. Silence. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade through flesh. Every person in the hall froze. Darius stood, descended the steps, walked toward Lyra until they stood face to face in the center of the hall. These are serious accusations, Queen Vale. They're true accusations, Your Majesty. Lyra met his eyes. And we both know it. What do you want? His voice was soft now, dangerous. You didn't come here just to expose corruption. You want something. I want you to choose. Lyra didn't back down. Between preserving this broken system or building something better. Between ruling through fear or earning loyalty. Between being remembered as the tyrant who let his empire rot or the king who had the courage to burn it down and start again. You're asking me to destroy everything my family built. I'm asking you to save it. Her eyes blazed now. Because this empire is dying, King Vane. The nobles are corrupt. The territories are restless. The people are losing faith. You can feel it. You've been feeling it for years. You're just too proud to admit that ruling through fear isn't enough anymore. And what do you propose instead? Lyra took a breath. Then she spoke the words that would change everything. I propose you dissolve the Imperial Council, strip the corrupt nobles of their titles, redistribute stolen territories to the communities that were displaced, and create a new system where Omegas have equal voice in governance, not as submissive class, as equals. The hall exploded, nobles screaming, guards drawing weapons, chaos spiraling toward violence. And in the center of it all, Darius Vane stared at the Omega Queen, who just demanded he tear apart everything he knew about power. His hand moved to his sword. The entire room went still. He could kill her right now, end this, prove that nothing had changed, that fear still ruled. His fingers wrapped around the hilt. Lyra didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched him with those forest green eyes that saw past the monster to something she thought could be better. Darius's jaw tightened, and then the great doors burst open. A guard stumbled in, armor scorched, bleeding from a dozen wounds. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "the capital is under attack." The guard's blood made dark trails across the marble floor as he stumbled forward, armor smoking from whatever had hit him. Darius moved without thinking, crossing the distance in 3 strides, catching the man before he collapsed. "Report." The word came out like a gunshot. Every noble in the hall froze mid-panic, their shouting cut off as cleanly as if someone had sliced through their vocal cords. The guard's eyes were wide, pupils blown from shock or pain, or both. "Southern Gate, Your Majesty. Explosions, fire. They came through the merchant district. Organized, military precision. We lost the first 2 defensive lines before we even knew what was happening." "Who?" Darius's grip tightened on the man's armor. "Who attacked? I don't know." The guard coughed, blood flecking his lips. No banners, no identification, just soldiers in black armor moving like they'd been planning this for months. "They're pushing toward the palace now. Commander Thane sent me to warn you while he holds the inner city checkpoints." "How many?" "At least 200, maybe more. They had explosives planted at key intersections. Took out our barracks before the alarm even sounded. Sir, they knew our positions. They knew our patrol routes. This wasn't a raid. This is an invasion." Darius lowered the guard to the floor, his mind already calculating angles and probabilities, and a dozen different ways this night could end in blood. Behind him, the nobles were erupting again, voices climbing over each other in a cacophony of fear and accusation. "This is her doing," Lord Marcus roared, jabbing a finger toward Lyra. "She brings her accusations and suddenly the capital is under attack? That's not coincidence." "She's been in this hall all evening," Lady Kira snapped back. "How could she coordinate an attack from inside these walls?" "Her people." Marcus was red-faced now, spittle flying. "Her guards, that advisor. They're all operatives. This was planned." Darius turned slowly. The movement was controlled, precise, the kind of calm that came right before something broke badly. He looked at Lyra Vale standing there in the center of the hall, her guards behind her, Clara at her side. She met his eyes without flinching. "Did you know about this?" It wasn't a question, it was a test. One wrong flicker of expression, and Darius would cut her down right there on the marble and deal with the political fallout later. Lyra's voice came out steady. "No." "That's convenient," someone muttered from the crowd. "It's the truth." Lyra turned to address the entire hall, speaking over the rising noise. "I came here to expose corruption, not to coordinate military action. If I wanted to attack the capital, I wouldn't waste time making speeches first." "Unless the speeches were a distraction," Lord Corvus growled. "Keep the king occupied while your forces move into position." "My forces?" Lyra's laugh was sharp, bitter. "I brought 6 guards and an advisor. Look at them. Do they look like an invasion force?" Darius did look. The Vale Guards were scarred and competent, the kind of fighters who'd survived hard country and harder fights. But they weren't soldiers. They had the wrong posture for it, too relaxed, too independent. Military training beat a certain rigidity into people that these guards didn't have, unless that was part of the act, too. "Your Majesty." Thane burst through the main doors, armor dented, sword already drawn. "We need to evacuate the palace, now." The attackers breached the 3rd defensive line. "They'll be at the gates in 20 minutes. Evacuate." Darius tasted the word like poison. "I don't evacuate. Sir, With respect, we don't know how many there are or what they're after. Until we have intelligence, the safest option is to move you to the secure bunker and… No. The word came out flat. Final. Darius turned back to the assembled nobles, seeing their fear, their confusion, the way they looked to him like children looking to a father who just realized he couldn't protect them from everything. He felt something dark and familiar settle into his chest, the weight of absolute power when absolute power wasn't enough. Listen closely, all of you. I'm going to the walls. I'm going to find whoever's attacking my city. And I'm going to kill them slowly enough that every wolf in this empire remembers what happens when you challenge the Iron Throne. He started toward the exit, stopped, turned back to Lyra. You're coming with me. Her expression didn't change. Why? Because if you're telling the truth, you're safer with me than locked in a room where any one of these nobles might decide you're a convenient scapegoat. And if you're lying, his voice went very quiet, very cold. I want you close enough to watch your plan fail before I separate your head from your shoulders. Lyra considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then she nodded to her guards. Stay with Clara. Protect her. My lady, one of them started to protest. That's an order. Lyra's tone left no room for argument. She looked back at Darius. Lead the way, Your Majesty. They moved through the palace corridors at a near run, Thane and 6 royal guards flanking them. The sound of explosions was closer now, muffled by stone walls but unmistakable. Somewhere in the city, buildings were burning, people were dying, and Darius was trapped in his own palace not knowing who was killing them or why. The frustration felt like acid in his veins. He'd spent 30 years making sure this couldn't happen. Fortifying the capital, training soldiers, building an intelligence network that should have caught wind of any organized attack weeks before it happened. But someone had slipped through. Someone had found the gaps in his perfect system and driven a knife straight through them. They reached the eastern ramparts. The night air hit like a slap, cold and sharp and full of smoke. Below them, the city was a map drawn in fire and shadow. The merchant district was burning, entire blocks consumed. And moving through the streets like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue were formations of soldiers in black armor, moving with professional efficiency, securing intersections, establishing defensive positions, pushing steadily toward the palace walls. Darius grabbed a spyglass from a guard, studied the attackers. They were good. Too good. Military precision that took years of training, discipline that came from constant drilling, and they were using tactics that shouldn't exist outside imperial military doctrine. Leapfrog advances, coordinated fire teams, suppression and movement patterns that Darius himself had helped design. Someone had trained these soldiers using his own playbook. Who has access to military training manuals? He said quietly. Thane moved beside him. Only high-ranking officers and the Imperial Council. Those documents are kept in secure vaults. No one can just… He stopped, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Darius lowered the spyglass, turned to look at Lyra. She was standing at the rampart edge, staring down at the burning city with an expression he couldn't quite read. You accuse the Council of corruption, Darius said slowly, of manipulating territory disputes for profit. What if it wasn't just about money? Lyra turned to face him. What if they wanted more than wealth? They wanted control. The words felt like stones in Darius's mouth. Real control, not just influence. They've been building an army, training soldiers, waiting for the right moment to move. And I gave them that moment. Lyra's voice was soft, but didn't waver. By exposing them publicly. By forcing you to choose between supporting them or stopping them. They knew you'd never let the accusations stand without investigation, so they moved first. A coup. Thane's hand tightened on his sword. The council is trying to overthrow the throne, not overthrow. Darius was thinking fast now, seeing the pattern. Replace. They can't rule openly, too many loyalists, too much resistance. But if they eliminate me and install a puppet king, claim I was killed defending the city from foreign invaders, they maintain the structure while controlling everything behind it. Another explosion rocked the city below, closer this time, maybe 6 blocks from the palace gates. Sir. One of the guards pointed. The eastern garrison just fell. They're consolidating forces for a push on the main gate. How many men do we have inside the palace? Darius demanded. 300, Thane said grimly. Maybe less. They hit our barracks first. Most of the standing army is scattered across the territories. We sent half our garrison to the western frontier last month to deal with those border skirmishes that the council manufactured. Lyra's eyes were hard now. They've been positioning your forces away from the capital for months. Those territory disputes I mentioned? Every one of them pulled soldiers away from your center of power. They've been bleeding your defenses while building their own army in secret. Darius stared at her, saw the truth of it in her expression. She'd known. Maybe not all of it, maybe not the timeline, but she'd known the council was planning something larger than simple corruption. How long have you known? Long enough to come here and warn you. Lyra stepped closer. I told you I came to break something, King Vane. I meant the system that allows this kind of rot. The council has been operating in shadows for years, using your authority as cover while undermining everything you built. If I'd come to you privately, they would have killed me before I reached the palace. If I'd started a rebellion in the territories, you would have crushed it before it gained traction. The only way to expose them was publicly. In front of witnesses they couldn't silence. So you gambled that I'd be more interested in truth than in maintaining appearances. I gambled that you were smart enough to recognize an enemy when someone pointed directly at them. Her voice carried an edge now. Was I wrong? The question hung between them like a blade. Below, the attackers were forming up for their assault. Above, the moon watched with silver indifference. And on the ramparts, two people who'd been enemies an hour ago stared at each other and recalculated everything. Darius made his decision. Thane, get every able body to the main gate. Archers on the walls, oil ready to pour. We hold that gate until dawn or until every one of us is dead. Clear? Clear, sir. Thane hesitated. And the council members who are still in the palace? Arrest them, all of them. Lock them in the lower cells. We'll sort the guilty from the innocent after we survive the night. He turned to Lyra. You claim the common wolves support you, that they're loyal to the idea of change. They are. Prove it. Open the palace armory. Send runners into the city. Tell every Omega, every Beta, every wolf who's sick of being crushed under noble boots that tonight they have a choice. Fight with us, or watch the Empire burn. Those who come get weapons and my protection. Those who don't, I'll remember their faces when this is over. Lyra's eyes widened fractionally. You're arming Omegas. I'm arming anyone willing to defend my city. Darius moved past her toward the stairs. I don't care about bloodline right now. I care about numbers and loyalty and whether someone can hold a spear when the gates come down. If your people want equality, tonight's their chance to earn it. He was halfway down the stairs when Lyra called after him. If we survive this, you know nothing goes back to the way it was. Darius didn't slow. I know. The walls will hold or they'll fall. But either way, the empire you ruled by fear is already dead. He stopped, looked back at her standing there in the torchlight with smoke rising behind her and the city burning below. Good, he said quietly. It was dying anyway. Better we bury it properly than watch it rot. Then he was moving again. Thane beside him, guards following, and behind them Lyra Vale making her own calculations about what came next. The palace transformed into a fortress in less than 30 minutes. Soldiers moving with desperate efficiency. Civilians being evacuated through hidden passages. Weapons distributed to anyone with hands steady enough to hold them. The armory doors opened and suddenly Omegas who'd spent their lives being told they were too weak to fight were standing shoulder to shoulder with guards, testing the weight of swords, learning to brace spears, their faces showing the same mixture of terror and determination that had won and lost 1,000 wars throughout history. Darius moved through the preparations like a force of nature, pointing out weak spots, repositioning defenders, his voice cutting through the chaos with commands that left no room for hesitation. This was what he'd been built for. Not speeches or politics or careful negotiation. This was immediate survival and overwhelming force, and the simple, brutal mathematics of war. He found himself back on the walls as the attackers began their assault. They came in 3 waves. The first hit the main gate with a battering ram reinforced with steel and powered by 30 men moving in synchronized rhythm. The gate shuddered, but held. Archers rained arrows from above. Oil poured down in burning streams. Men screamed and died and were replaced by fresh soldiers who stepped over corpses without breaking stride. Professional, Darius muttered. Too professional. Beside him, Lyra was watching the assault with calculating eyes. She'd picked up a bow from somewhere, had it strung and ready, her stance suggesting she knew how to use it. "You fight?" Darius asked. "I survive." She drew and released in one smooth motion. An attacker in black armor fell with an arrow through his throat. That's not always the same thing. The second wave hit before the first had fully retreated. Ladders against the walls now. Soldiers climbing with shields locked overhead to deflect arrows. Defenders pushing the ladders back. Bodies falling. The walls becoming slick with blood. Darius drew his sword, moved along the rampart to where 3 attackers had gained the wall and were cutting through defenders. He hit them like a collapsing building. No elegance. Just brutal, efficient violence that came from 3 decades of surviving fights that should have killed him. His blade opened the first soldier from shoulder to hip, reversed to catch the second through the throat. The third got his sword up in time to block, but not in time to stop Darius from grabbing him by the helmet and slamming his head into the stone wall hard enough to crack metal. The man dropped. Darius kicked the body off the wall, looked up to see Lyra staring at him. "What?" "Nothing." She returned to her bow. "Just remembering why everyone fears you. Fear's a tool." He wiped his blade on a dead man's cloak. "Tonight, it's the only thing keeping these walls standing." The third wave was the worst. They'd brought siege equipment now. Real machinery. Catapults launching burning pitch, covered rams at the gate, and climbing teams hitting 6 different points along the wall simultaneously, spreading the defenders thin. Thane appeared at Darius's side, bleeding from a cut above his eye. "Sir, we can't hold all the breach points. We need to fall back to the inner courtyard. Establish a defensive line we can actually maintain. If we fall back, they'll burn the palace." Darius was breathing hard now, sweat cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "We hold until reinforcements arrive. Sir, the nearest garrison is 8 hours away, even if they ride hard. We don't have 8 hours. Then we hold until we don't." Darius looked at his commander. "I'm not giving them the throne, Thane. Not to the council, not to whoever they hired to take it. This is my city, my empire, and I will paint these walls red before I let corrupt nobles steal what my family built." Thane studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." He turned to the defenders. "You heard the king. We hold, every inch, every stone, until the sun comes up or until every last one of us is dead. For the Empire." The shout came back ragged but fierce. For the Empire. The fighting intensified. Hours blurred together in a nightmare of clashing steel and screaming men, and the constant pressure of knowing that one breakthrough, one failed defensive line, would collapse everything. Darius fought until his arms burned, killed until his sword arm felt like lead, moved from breach point to breach point wherever the fighting was thickest, his presence alone often enough to rally defenders who were starting to break. And everywhere he went, he saw Omegas fighting beside royal guards. Saw common wolves defending walls they'd never been allowed to stand on before. Saw the beginning of something that looked almost like loyalty built on something other than fear. It was Lyra who spotted the pattern first. "They're not trying to breach the walls anymore," she called over the noise. "Look, they're pulling back." Darius looked. She was right. The attackers were withdrawing in good order, taking their wounded, leaving their dead, falling back beyond arrow range. "It's a trap," Thane said immediately. "They're regrouping for a final push." "No." Lyra shook her head. "Look at the fires. They're dying down. They hit us hard and fast and failed to break through. Now they're reassessing." Darius watched the retreat, saw the organized withdrawal, the lack of panic. These weren't soldiers routing. These were professionals executing a tactical retreat after meeting stronger resistance than expected. They underestimated our numbers. He felt a grim satisfaction, thought the attack on the barracks had crippled our forces. They weren't expecting civilians to fight. They weren't expecting you to arm Omegas, Lyra corrected. That changed their math. A runner appeared, gasping for breath. "Your Majesty, message from Commander Thane's scouts. The attackers are withdrawing to the southern district. They've seized control of 3 neighborhoods and are fortifying positions, so they're not retreating." Darius felt cold realization settle over him. They're occupying, taking territory instead of the palace, setting up for a siege. "Smart." Lyra's voice was grim. "They can't take the palace by force with the defenders we have, but if they control enough of the city, they can starve us out. Wait for supplies to run low, for morale to break, then offer terms." "What kind of terms?" The kind where you abdicate in exchange for your life and the lives of your loyalists. The kind where the council installs a puppet king and blames the whole thing on foreign agitators or rebel forces. The kind where they win without ever having to admit they were behind it. Darius was silent for a long moment, staring out at his burning city, at the districts now under enemy control, at the palace walls that had held but couldn't hold forever. "We need to hit them before they consolidate," he said finally. "Take the fight to them while they're still organizing." "Sir, that's suicide." Thane stepped forward. "We barely held the walls. If we leave the palace, we'll be fighting in streets they control with forces we can't reinforce." "I know." Darius turned to look at his assembled defenders. Exhausted guards, wounded soldiers, Omegas who'd picked up weapons for the first time tonight and learned they could be as fierce as any alpha when their survival depended on it. "I need 50 volunteers, fast, brutal, willing to die if that's what it takes. We're going to hit their command post before sunrise and cut the head off this snake. Your Majesty, I can't let you—" "You can't stop me." Darius's tone left no room for argument. "I won't sit in this palace and wait for them to tighten the noose. I won't give the council the satisfaction of watching me starve. We attack now or we die slowly. Those are the options." He stepped forward to address the assembled fighters directly. "Every wolf here tonight proved something. You proved that courage doesn't come from bloodline. That loyalty isn't born from fear. That when the Empire needed defending, you stood on these walls and bled for something bigger than yourselves. Now I'm asking who's willing to do it again. Who's willing to walk into hell with me and burn our enemies out by the roots?" The silence stretched, then a voice from the back. A young Omega with blood drying on his face and a borrowed sword in his hand. "I'll go." Another voice, an older beta who'd lost his helmet somewhere in the fighting. "And me." Then more. A flood of volunteers stepping forward until Darius had to raise his hand to stop them. 50, he repeated. "Experienced fighters first, then anyone who can keep up and follow orders without hesitation." The selection took 10 minutes. 50 wolves, mixed alphas and betas, and 6 omegas who refused to be left behind. Thane leading. Weapons checked. Armor secured. The kind of fast, brutal preparation that happened before raids that everyone knew might be one-way trips. Darius was checking his own gear when Lyra approached. "I'm coming with you." "No, you're not." "Yes, I am." Her voice was flat. "You need someone who knows how the council operates, how they think, where they'd put their command structure. I spent months studying these people, King Vane. I know their patterns. You also have no combat training, and I'm not running a suicide mission with civilians. I've been keeping communities alive in territory you couldn't conquer for 8 years. Don't confuse my lack of formal training with inability to survive." She met his eyes. "And if we're being honest, you need me there to legitimize whatever comes after. If you slaughter the council's forces alone, you're just a tyrant crushing a rebellion. If I'm with you, it's the old power and the new power working together. It changes the narrative." Darius wanted to argue, couldn't find a hole in her logic. The realization that she was right tasted like copper in his mouth. "Fine, but you follow orders. No heroics, no speeches. You see an opening, you take it. You get in trouble, you run. Clear?" "Crystal." Lyra checked the bow in her hands. "One more thing." "What?" "If we don't make it back, make sure Clara gets to the Vale safely. She has copies of all the evidence I brought. Names, dates, connections. Everything needed to prosecute the council members who survive. The information doesn't die with me." "We're coming back," Darius said flatly. "But if we don't?" He stared at her for a moment, saw the steel underneath the calm exterior, the absolute certainty that she was walking into something that might kill her and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. "If we don't, I'll burn the council to ash and scatter Clara to the winds with enough gold to rebuild the Vale 10 times over." Satisfied? Lyra smiled that cold smile. Satisfied. They moved out as false dawn touched the eastern sky. 50 wolves sliding through streets that stank of smoke and blood. The city was a graveyard at this hour, bodies in the streets, burned buildings still smoldering, the kind of devastation that took years to rebuild and was accomplished in a single night. Darius led them through alleys and side streets, avoiding main roads where the attackers had established checkpoints. His knowledge of the capital was absolute. Every shortcut, every hidden passage, every rooftop route that could get you from the Palace District to the southern neighborhoods without being seen. They encountered their first patrol 3 blocks into enemy territory. 6 soldiers in black armor. Alert. Professional. Moving in a standard sweep pattern, Darius signaled. The patrol died without making a sound. Knives in the dark. Bodies dragged into shadows. Efficiency born from necessity. They pressed deeper. The occupied zone became obvious quickly. Doors marked with chalked symbols. Intersections fortified with makeshift barricades. The attackers had moved in fast, but they'd done it right. Established control, secured supply lines. This wasn't a raid. This was the beginning of a permanent occupation. The command post was in an old merchant house that had been converted into a fortress. Guards at every entrance. Archers on the roof. The kind of defensive setup that would cost dozens of lives in a frontal assault. Darius crouched in the shadows across the street, studying the layout. Beside him, Lyra pointed to a side entrance barely visible behind a stack of crates. Service door. Probably connects to the kitchens. Less fortified than the main entrance. Still guarded. Not as heavily. She glanced at him. Your people can handle 2 guards quieter than they can handle 20. Darius nodded, signaled to Thane. 2 minutes later, the side entrance guards were dead and the strike team was inside. The merchant house smelled like expensive wine and old money gone sour. They moved through storage rooms and servant passages, following the sound of voices deeper into the building. Up a set of stairs, along a hallway lined with portraits of fat merchants who died believing their wealth would last forever. The voices got louder. A door ahead slightly ajar, light spilling out. Darius held up a fist. Everyone stopped. He moved close enough to hear. Multiple voices inside. The discussion heated. We should have taken the palace when we had momentum. That was Chancellor Aldrich. Darius recognized the pompous nasal tone anywhere. This occupation strategy is too cautious. The palace was too well defended. A second voice. Counselor Thorne. The Omega fighters changed the equation. We need to reassess. They're not fighters. They're frightened civilians with borrowed weapons, Aldrich snapped. If we'd pressed harder, we'd have lost twice as many men and still failed to breach the walls. This from a third speaker Darius didn't recognize. Military professional by the sound of it. The commander of the attack force. Your intelligence was flawed, Chancellor. You promised the garrison would be scattered and demoralized. Instead, they fought like demons. Because Vane armed every peasant in the palace, Aldrich snarled. That's what happens when you let desperation override sense, or when you underestimate your enemy. The military voice again. Cold now. Contemptuous. You hired me to take a city, not to clean up your political miscalculations. The assault failed. We're in occupation mode. That changes the timeline. How long until we can try again? A week. Maybe 2 if Vane manages to get supplies in. But he won't. We control 3 districts, all roads in and out. He's trapped in that palace with however many people he managed to squeeze inside. And trapped wolves eat each other eventually. Darius had heard enough. He signaled to Thane, to the wolves behind him. They'd rehearsed this a dozen times in a dozen different raids. Everyone knew their role. On 3, 1, 2. The door exploded inward as 6 wolves hit it simultaneously. Darius was through first, taking in the room in a single glance. Large chamber. Central table with maps spread across it. 8 people. 3 in noble clothes, 5 in military gear. Weapons, but not drawn. Surprise absolute. He killed the first man before anyone even reached for a sword. Second man got his blade half drawn before Thane's knife opened his throat. The room erupted into chaos. Steel clashing, men shouting, the strike team pouring through the door like a flood. Chancellor Aldrich tried to run, got 3 steps before Lyra put an arrow through his leg. He went down screaming. Counselor Thorne drew a short blade and actually managed to get in a guard position before Darius disarmed him with a casual efficiency that would have been impressive if it wasn't so brutal. The sword spun away. Thorne's hand broke with an audible crack. He crumpled. The military commander was better. Real training, real skill. He got his sword up and traded actual blows with Darius for maybe 10 seconds before realizing he was outmatched and trying to disengage. Darius didn't let him. Pressed forward, caught the commander's blade on his own, twisted. The commander's sword went flying. Then Darius's boot caught him in the chest hard enough to crack ribs and send him sprawling. 30 seconds. Start to finish. 8 men neutralized, 3 dead, 5 captured. The strike team secured the room, disarmed the survivors, bound their hands with strips torn from expensive curtains. Darius stood over Chancellor Aldrich bleeding on the floor, the man who'd served on his council for 15 years, who'd eaten at his table, who'd sworn oaths of loyalty and meant none of them. Why? The word came out quiet, dangerous. Aldrich looked up with eyes full of hate and fear in equal measure. Because you're a tyrant. Because you rule through fear and violence and intimidation. Because someone had to stop you. Darius crouched down, brought his face close to Aldrich's. I ruled with what worked. I maintained order. I protected the empire. You and your fellow council members were stealing territory and manipulating wars for profit while I was keeping the borders secure. So try again. Why? Aldrich's laugh was wet, bitter. Because you would never give us real power. You kept us as advisors, pets, useful tools you could discard whenever convenient. We wanted more. You wanted my throne. We wanted the empire we deserved. Aldrich's face twisted. You're a relic, Vane. A monster from an older age. The empire doesn't need fear anymore. It needs structure. Management. People who understand economics and trade and building lasting systems. Not just a wolf with a big sword who crushes anyone who questions him. Darius stood, looked at the other captured council members, at the military commander who'd sold his skills to traitors, at the maps on the table showing their occupation plan. You hired mercenaries to attack your own capital, killed hundreds of your own people, burned districts that will take years to rebuild. And you call me the monster? We call you the thing that had to be removed, Aldrich spat. By any means necessary. Darius turned to Thane. Get them out of here. Back to the palace. Lock them in the deepest cells we have. We'll hold a trial when the city is secure, sir. Thane gestured to the maps. What about their forces? The soldiers occupying the southern districts? Darius studied the maps, saw the deployment patterns, supply caches, guard rotations, everything he needed to know. Leave a team here to secure the command post. Send runners to the remaining attack forces with a message. Their leadership is captured. Their plan is finished. Any soldier who surrenders before noon gets mercy. Any who keep fighting after that dies on a spike in the main square. Make sure they understand those are the only options. He turned to leave, paused, looked back at Aldrich one more time. You were right about one thing, Chancellor. The Empire doesn't need fear anymore, but it needed something you and your corrupt friends could never provide. It needed someone willing to change, to admit when the old ways were failing, to burn down the system if that's what survival required. You wanted power for its own sake. I wanted the Empire to endure. That's the difference between ruling and just wearing a crown. Aldrich said nothing, just stared with eyes that held all the hatred of a small man who'd reached for something too large and had it crush him. They left the command post as sunrise turned the sky from black to gray to gold. The strike team moved back through the occupied districts unmolested now, the mercenary patrols having received word that their commanders were captured and their cause was lost. Some surrendered immediately. Others vanished into the city's shadowy places, disappearing the way professional soldiers always did when a contract went bad. By the time they reached the palace walls, the fighting was over. The city lay broken and smoking under the morning light, damage that would take months to repair, wounds that would scar the capital for years. But the palace still stood, the throne still held, and walking through the gates with 50 exhausted warriors at his back, Darius Vane felt something he hadn't felt in 3 decades, uncertainty about what came next. The throne room filled with survivors as word spread that the king had returned. Nobles who'd hidden during the fighting, guards who'd held the walls, civilians who'd picked up weapons and discovered they could bleed for something bigger than themselves. And standing off to the side, watching everything with those calculating green eyes, Lyra Vale and her advisor Clara. Darius took his seat. The Blackwood throne felt heavier than usual, like it understood that something fundamental had shifted in the night and was waiting to see what that meant. The captured council members were dragged before him in chains. Aldrich, Thorne, 3 others who'd participated in the conspiracy, all of them bleeding, broken, stripped of the dignity they'd worn like armor. These men, Darius said quietly, orchestrated an attack on their own city, hired mercenaries to kill their own people, burned districts and murdered civilians in a failed coup attempt. Under imperial law, the penalty for treason is death. Execute them, Lord Marcus called out from the assembled nobles. Make an example. Hang them from the palace walls, Lady Kira agreed. Show everyone what happens to traitors. Darius raised a hand. Silence fell. He stood, descended from the throne, walked to where the prisoners knelt in their chains. You wanted change, he said to Aldrich. You wanted the Empire to evolve beyond fear and violence. You thought I was too rigid to allow it, too committed to old methods, so you tried to remove me by becoming exactly the thing you claimed I was. Brutal, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for power. Aldrich glared up at him but said nothing. You were right that the Empire needed to change. Darius turned to address the entire hall. You were wrong about everything else. Change doesn't come from betrayal. It comes from courage, from being willing to admit when the old ways are failing and having the strength to build something better. He looked at Lyra, at the Omegas who'd fought on the walls, at the common wolves who'd proven their loyalty meant something. Last night, this empire defended itself. Not because of fear, because people chose to fight for it, chose to believe it could be something worth protecting. That's the foundation we build on now, not terror, not manipulation, choice, loyalty earned instead of demanded. He turned back to the prisoners. You'll stand trial, public, transparent. Every piece of evidence will be presented, every witness will be heard. And when you're found guilty, which you will be, the sentence will be exile, not death. Because I won't let your martyrdom become a rallying point for future traitors. You'll live out your days in the far territories, stripped of titles and wealth, knowing you failed and that the empire you tried to destroy became stronger without you. The hall erupted in protest, voices shouting for blood, for vengeance, for the kind of justice that ended with bodies decorating walls. Darius let them shout, then raised his hand again. Silence returned, grudging but absolute. I understand the desire for revenge, but revenge is a tool of the old empire, the dying empire. If we're going to survive what's coming, we need to be better than our worst impulses. He paused. That includes me. He returned to the throne, sat down with the weight of 3 decades and one impossible night pressing down on his shoulders. Effective immediately, the Imperial Council is dissolved. All current members will be investigated. Those found complicit in the coup attempt will face trial. Those proven innocent will be reassigned to positions where they can serve the Empire honestly, or they can leave with their wealth intact and their reputations damaged but not destroyed. The noble section of the hall went very quiet. In place of the council, Darius continued, a new governing body will be established. Representatives from every territory, alphas, betas, and for the first time in imperial history, omegas. Equal voice, equal authority, checked by the throne but not controlled by it. We call it the assembly. Now the entire hall was silent. This was revolutionary. This was everything the empire had been built to prevent. Power shared instead of hoarded. Voices heard instead of silenced. This is madness, someone muttered. This is survival. Darius's voice cut through the whispers. Last night proved that fear alone can't hold an empire together. Loyalty can. Trust can. But only if people believe they have stake in what we're protecting. The assembly gives them that stake. And who, Lord Marcus demanded, will lead this assembly? Darius looked at Lyra. She looked back, understanding what he was about to do and the weight it carried. Lyra Vale of the Vale territory will serve as first speaker. She'll coordinate the assembly, ensure all territories are represented fairly, and report directly to the throne on matters requiring imperial authority. She'll have power to investigate corruption, challenge unjust laws, and propose reforms. She'll be the voice of every wolf who's been voiceless. The hall exploded, nobles shouting, guards looking confused, civilians uncertain whether to celebrate or riot. Darius stood, the shouting cut off like someone had torn out everyone's vocal cords. This is not a request. This is not open for debate. This is the future of the Iron Moon Empire. You can accept it and help build it. Or you can leave. But if you stay, you follow these rules. No more corruption. No more manipulation. No more crushing people because they were born into the wrong bloodline. We earn loyalty now, all of us. Starting with me. He looked at Thane. Implement the changes. Immediately. Sir, this will take weeks to organize. Then we start now and work until it's done. He turned to address the hall one final time. The capital needs rebuilding. The districts need securing. Survivors need food and shelter and medical care. Everyone here has a role. Figure out what you're good at and start doing it. We don't have time for hesitation. He descended from the throne, started walking toward the exit. Your Majesty. Lyra's voice stopped him. Where are you going? To the districts that burned last night, to help clear rubble and treat wounded and show every wolf in this city that their king doesn't just give orders from a throne. He glanced back at her. You're welcome to join me, First Speaker, unless you have better things to do. Lyra smiled. That cold, knowing smile that said she saw exactly what he was doing and approved. I'll get my coat. They worked through the day. King and Omega Queen side by side in the ruins, lifting stones, distributing supplies, talking to families who'd lost everything, not giving speeches or making promises, just being present, being human, being the thing the Empire had forgotten its rulers could be. And as the sun set on the capital, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of crimson and gold, something new began to take root in the burned districts and broken buildings. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the possibility of hope. The sense that maybe, impossibly, the empire that had ruled through fear for 3 centuries might learn to rule through something else. It was Thane who found Darius at midnight. The king was still in the southern district, helping a family salvage possessions from their burned home. Sir, we need to talk, privately. They moved to a quiet corner, the street empty except for guards maintaining watch. I've been reviewing the evidence Lyra provided, Thane said quietly. The documentation of council corruption. Sir, it's worse than we thought. How much worse? The council wasn't just manipulating territory disputes. They were facilitating slave trade in the outer provinces, selling Omega children to work mines in territories so remote imperial law doesn't reach. We're talking systematic abuse stretching back 15 years, thousands of victims. Darius felt something cold and ancient wake up in his chest, the part of him that had spent decades being exactly the monster everyone feared. Names. I want every name connected to this, every noble who participated, every official who turned a blind eye, every merchant who profited. Lyra has them, along with testimony from survivors and financial records that trace everything back to specific council members. Thane paused. There's more. There's always more. Some of the nobles in that hall tonight were involved, not in the coup, in the slavery operation. If this becomes public, it won't just be council members facing justice. It'll be families who've held power for generations. Good. Darius's voice went flat, cold. Let them fall. Let every corrupt bloodline in this empire understand that no one is protected anymore. We burn it all out, or we change nothing. Sir, if we move too fast, we could trigger civil war. The noble houses won't accept this level of upheaval. They'll fight back. Then we fight them. Darius met Thane's eyes. I spent 30 years maintaining order by crushing anyone who challenged the system. Now the system itself is the challenge. And I don't care how many noble houses I have to destroy to fix it. The assembly, the reforms, the justice for every victim. All of it happens, no matter the cost. Thane studied him for a long moment. You've changed. No. Darius looked back at the burned district. The families trying to rebuild. The survivors who'd fought on the walls because they chose to. I'm just finally becoming what I should have been all along. A king who serves the empire instead of making the empire serve him. He started walking back toward the family's home, paused, turned back. Tell Lyra I need to see the full documentation tomorrow. Every name, every crime, every shred of evidence. We're going to do this right. Public trials, transparent justice. And when it's done, every wolf in this empire will know that corruption dies here. Yes, sir. Thane hesitated. One more thing. The mercenaries we captured. They're asking for terms. What kind of terms? Safe passage out of the empire in exchange for testimony about who hired them. They claim they have information about other plots, other nobles planning similar coups in different territories. Accept their terms. Get the testimony. Then escort them to the border and make sure every mercenary company in the known world understands what happens when you take a contract against the Iron Moon Empire. And what happens? You live, but you live with everyone knowing you failed. That's worse than death for men who make their living on reputation. Thane nodded. Left to execute the orders, Darius returned to helping the family, worked until his hands were raw and his back screamed and the sun rose on a second day of the new empire. It was going to take years to rebuild, years to root out all the corruption, years to establish the assembly and train representatives and teach the noble houses that the old rules were dead. But for the first time in 30 years, Darius Vane looked at the future and saw something other than the endless cycle of fear and submission and crushing anyone who stepped out of line. He saw possibility. He saw change. And standing on the other side of that possibility, working beside him in the ruins, was the Omega Queen who'd walked into his throne room and refused to be afraid. Together, they would remake the empire or die trying. There was no third option left. The assembly took shape over 3 weeks like a building rising from rubble. Representatives arrived from every corner of the empire. Alphas who'd ruled territories for generations. Betas who'd spent their lives managing the machinery of governance. And for the first time in imperial history, Omegas who walked into the palace not as servants or supplicants, but as equals with voices that mattered. Darius watched it happen from his throne with the strange detachment of a man who'd built something he didn't fully recognize anymore. The Great Hall had been reconfigured. The throne remained at the head, but the tables now formed a wide circle instead of a hierarchy. Every seat the same distance from the center, every voice theoretically equal. It was Lyra's design, implemented with ruthless efficiency by administrators who understood that symbols mattered as much as substance. The first full assembly session convened on a cold morning when frost painted the windows white. Darius opened with words he'd rehearsed a dozen times and still felt foreign on his tongue. This assembly exists to serve the empire through truth and transparency. Every territory has representation. Every voice will be heard. The throne maintains authority over military matters and imperial security, but governance, law, and justice are now shared responsibilities. We succeed together or we fail together. The assembled representatives watched him with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion to barely concealed contempt. The noble alphas sat rigid, clearly hating every moment of this new arrangement. The common wolves looked uncertain, like they were waiting for the trap to spring. And the Omegas held themselves with the careful dignity of people who'd won something they weren't sure they'd be allowed to keep. Lyra sat in the first speaker's position, directly across from the throne. When Darius finished, she stood. The Assembly's first priority is addressing the corruption exposed during the coup attempt. We have documentation of systematic abuse spanning 15 years. Territory manipulation, resource theft, and slave trade involving Omega children sold to remote mining operations. She paused, letting the words settle like stones in water. The evidence is irrefutable. The question is how we proceed with justice. The hall erupted immediately, voices overlapping, accusations flying, noble representatives demanding to see the evidence, common representatives calling for immediate trials, the chaos building toward something that felt dangerous. Order. Darius didn't shout, didn't need to. The single word cut through the noise like a blade. First speaker Vale has the floor. You'll hear her out or you'll leave. Silence returned, hostile but absolute. Lyra continued. We propose public trials beginning in 2 weeks. All accused parties will have access to legal representation. All evidence will be presented transparently. Verdicts will be determined by a jury of 12, drawn from mixed bloodlines and territories. No one judges their own. No one escapes scrutiny. And if noble houses refuse to accept these verdicts, Alpha Lord Breathen demanded. He was an older wolf, scarred and gray, representing territories that had held power since before the Empire existed. What then? You drag us to judgment like common criminals? If you committed crimes, yes. Lyra's voice stayed level. Bloodline doesn't grant immunity from justice. Not anymore. Breathen's face went red. You overstep, Omega. This assembly may grant you voice, but it doesn't make you equal to those who've bled for this empire across generations. I've bled plenty. Lyra met his glare without flinching. The difference is, I bled because your kind decided my blood was worth less than yours. That ends now. This is chaos, another noble alpha shouted. You're tearing apart the structures that maintained order for 3 centuries. The structures were rotting, someone else called back. A beta from the Eastern Territories. We all knew it. We just pretended not to see. The argument escalated. Representatives on their feet now. Accusations becoming threats. The careful civility of the first session collapsing into something that looked dangerously like the beginning of another war. Darius stood. The effect was immediate. Every wolf in that hall had spent their lives understanding what happened when the Iron King rose from his throne. Silence fell like a hammer. Lord Brethen, you question the Assembly's authority. Do you also question mine? Brethen swallowed hard. No, Your Majesty. Then sit down. Darius let his gaze sweep the entire hall. All of you, this isn't a negotiation. The trials happen. The evidence gets presented. Justice gets served. And any house that tries to interfere will answer to me personally. Are we clear? Murmurs of assent. Reluctant but real. Good. Darius returned to his seat. Continue, first speaker. The session lasted 6 more hours. Logistics, procedures, the grinding machinery of governance being built in real time by people who'd never worked together before. It was messy, inefficient. Arguments broke out every 20 minutes, but by the end they had a framework. The trials would begin in 2 weeks. The accused would be held in secured facilities. The juries would be selected through random lottery. Evidence would be presented by independent investigators. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Darius found Lyra on the eastern balcony after the session ended. She stood alone, staring out at the rebuilt districts where construction crews worked to repair what the coup attempt had destroyed. That went well, he said dryly. It went exactly as expected. Lyra didn't turn. Change isn't comfortable, especially for people who benefited from the old system. Brethen's going to be a problem. Brethan represents 12 other noble houses who feel the same way. She finally looked at him. They'll resist every reform, undermine every decision, and the moment they sense weakness, they'll try to tear the whole thing down. So we don't show weakness. Easier said than done. Lyra leaned against the balcony rail. You're asking people to trust a system that's been their enemy for generations. That takes more than declarations and good intentions. It takes proof. The trials will be proof. If they're fair, if they're transparent, if the verdicts actually reflect the evidence instead of political convenience. She met his eyes. One manipulated outcome and we lose credibility forever. This has to be clean. It will be. Darius moved to stand beside her. I didn't tear down my own council just to rebuild the same corruption under a different name. I know, her voice softened slightly. That's why I'm here. Because you actually mean it. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city. Then Lyra spoke again, quieter now. Claire's been getting reports from the outer territories. Some of the displaced Omegas we've been trying to relocate are refusing to return to their original communities. They say they don't trust the local alphas to protect them. They want guarantees. What kind of guarantees? Legal ones, written into imperial law. Protection from retaliation. Right to refuse assignments. Ability to leave pacts that abuse them. She paused. They want autonomy. That's revolutionary. That's survival. Lyra turned to face him fully. You changed the governance structure. Now we need to change the social structure. Laws that actually protect people instead of just maintaining order. It's the next step. And if the noble houses refuse, then we have a bigger fight ahead than we thought. Her expression was unreadable. But we fight it anyway. Because going back isn't an option anymore. Darius studied her. Saw the determination. The absolute certainty that she was right and that being right was worth whatever came next. You're going to push until something breaks, aren't you? I'm going to push until something changes. Lyra smiled that cold smile. The question is whether you'll push with me or get out of the way. Before Darius could answer, Thane appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty, we have a situation. The military briefing room was deep in the palace's secured levels. Stone walls, no windows. Guards at every entrance. The kind of place where bad news got delivered and worse decisions got made. Thane spread a map across the central table. Reports from our eastern frontier. 3 territories have refused to send representatives to the assembly. They're claiming the entire restructuring is illegitimate. Which territories? Darius demanded. Ironwood, Blackridge, Silverpine. all controlled by old bloodline families, all heavily fortified, and all coordinating their resistance. This isn't three separate rebellions. This is organized. How many soldiers? Combined? Maybe 800. Well-trained, well-supplied. If they moved together, they could take back enough territory to establish a separate power base. Darius stared at the map, saw the territories marked in red. Strategic positions. Resource-rich. Defensible terrain. If they declared independence, it would trigger a cascade. Other noble houses would see an opportunity. The empire would fracture. Options, he said flatly. We can negotiate, offer concessions, try to bring them back peacefully. Thane didn't sound hopeful. Or we can mobilize forces and crush them before they consolidate. Make an example. The old Darius would have chosen the second option without hesitation. Overwhelming force, brutal efficiency, fear as the ultimate tool of control. But the old Darius had ruled an empire that was rotting from the inside. Send envoys, Darius said finally. Tell them I'll meet with their leaders personally. Neutral ground, no armies, just conversation. Sir, that's a risk. If they're planning actual rebellion, walking into their territory makes you vulnerable. If they're planning rebellion, we're already vulnerable. Crushing them just proves their point that the reforms are a lie. We need to give them a chance to be part of this. And if they refuse, then we revisit our options. But we try peace first. He looked at Thane. Arrange the meeting, 1 week from today. I'll take a small guard. Make it clear I'm coming to listen, not to threaten. Thane looked like he wanted to argue. Didn't, just nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. After he left, Darius stood alone in the briefing room, staring at the map, at the red territories marking the edges of his control, at the fragility of what they'd built. Power was always about perception, about making everyone believe you were strong enough that challenging you was suicide. But the moment they stopped believing, the moment they saw cracks in the armor, the entire structure collapsed, and Darius could feel the cracks spreading. The meeting took place in a fortified manor house on the border between Ironwood and Blackridge territory. Neutral ground technically, though the presence of armed guards at every entrance made it clear whose hospitality this really was. Darius arrived with Thane and 4 royal guards, minimal security, a calculated show of trust that felt more like walking into a trap with your eyes open. The 3 Alpha Lords waited in a great hall that smelled like old wood and older money. Lord Brethan from the Assembly, Lord Kalin of Ironwood, a younger wolf with the kind of aristocratic arrogance that came from generations of unchallenged authority, and Lady Serath of Silverpine, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, watching Darius like a predator assessing prey. Your Majesty, Brethan spoke first. Thank you for accepting our invitation. You didn't invite me. Darius remained standing. You refused to participate in the assembly and forced my hand. Let's be accurate about what's happening here. Kalin smiled, a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Direct. I appreciate that. Then let me be direct as well. We don't recognize the Assembly's authority. We don't accept the dissolution of the Imperial Council, and we certainly don't acknowledge an Omega's right to sit as first speaker. Because you're afraid, Darius said quietly. The 3 Alphas stiffened. Not of military action, not of punishment. You're afraid that if Omegas gain real power, you lose the one advantage your bloodlines have held for centuries. The ability to exploit people who had no recourse. That's what this is really about. This is about maintaining order, Lady Serath said coldly. About preserving the structures that built this empire. You're tearing apart everything for the sake of idealistic reforms that will collapse the moment they meet reality. Reality is that the old system was collapsing already. Darius moved closer to the table between them. That's why my own council tried to overthrow me. Because the rot had spread so deep they thought they could get away with it. The reforms aren't idealism, they're triage. You could have cleaned the corruption without empowering Omegas, Kalin countered, without creating an assembly that gives voice to wolves who have no stake in the Empire's security. They have every stake. They just never had representation. Darius planted his hands on the table. And now that they do, you're terrified they'll use it against you. Which they will. Because you've spent generations giving them reasons to. Brethan leaned back in his chair. So you admit this is revenge, payment for past sins. This is justice. There's a difference. Not to those of us being judged. Lady Serath's voice was ice. You're asking noble houses to submit to trials conducted by wolves who've hated us their entire lives. You're redistributing territory that's belonged to our families for centuries. You're dismantling every protection we built, and you call it justice. I call it overdue. Darius straightened. But I didn't come here to debate philosophy. I came to offer you a choice. Join the assembly. Participate in the reforms. Help build a system that actually works instead of just pretending it does. Or refuse and face the consequences. Threats, Kalen said softly. How predictable. Facts. If you declare independence, every other dissatisfied noble house will follow. The empire fragments. We spend the next decade fighting civil wars that destroy everything we've built. Or you work with me and we navigate this transition together. Work with you. Brithen laughed, bitter and hard. Kneel to an Omega Queen and pretend we're equals. Accept trials that will destroy our houses. Watch everything we fought for be torn apart by wolves who don't understand what it costs to build. That's your offer? Yes. The three alphas exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then Lady Serath spoke. We have a counteroffer. Darius waited. Dissolve the assembly. Keep the Imperial Council, but with reformed oversight. The trials can proceed, but with noble representation on the juries. And the Omega Queen goes back to her mountain territory where she belongs. Do that, and we'll acknowledge your authority. Refuse, and we declare the Eastern Territories independent and let the Empire sort itself out. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Darius could feel Thane tensing behind him, could sense his guards reaching for weapons, could taste the violence about to erupt in this room. He thought about 30 years of crushing rebellions, of maintaining order through fear, of being exactly the monster everyone needed him to be because the alternative was chaos. He thought about Lyra standing on the balcony saying going back isn't an option. He thought about the Omegas who'd fought on the walls, who'd picked up weapons for the first time and discovered they could be fierce. Who'd earned the right to voices that mattered? Then he looked at the three alphas across the table and spoke words that sealed everything that came after. No. The word fell like a stone into deep water. Lady Serath's expression hardened. Then we're done here. Not quite. Darius leaned forward. You want me to choose between preserving the reforms and preventing civil war. But that's a false choice. Because if I abandon the reforms to appease you, I lose the loyalty of every common wolf who fought for this new empire. They'll rebel. Not because they want power, but because I'll have proven that change was a lie and that the strong will always sacrifice the weak to maintain control. So you choose chaos, Kalen said. I choose the hard path, the one that doesn't promise easy answers. Darius straightened. The assembly stands. The trials proceed. Lyra Vale remains first speaker. And if you declare independence, I'll bring every loyal force in this empire down on your heads until you surrender or die. That's not a threat. That's a guarantee. You'll destroy the empire trying to save it, Brethen warned. Maybe. Or maybe I'll save it by being willing to burn out the rot, even when the rot is protected by centuries of tradition and noble bloodlines. Either way, we're moving forward. You can come with us, or you can get crushed. Those are your options. The three alphas stood as one. Brethen's face was stone. Kalen's showed barely restrained fury. Lady Serath just looked sad, like she'd predicted this outcome and hoped to be wrong. Then the Eastern Territories are in rebellion as of this moment. Brethen's voice carried formal finality. We reject the Assembly's authority. We reject your reforms, and we will defend our territories against any force you send. He turned to leave. The other two followed. Darius watched them go, felt the weight of what he'd just done settling onto his shoulders like iron chains. Thane moved beside him. Sir, we need to leave, now. If they're declaring rebellion, this location isn't safe. They won't attack me here. Not yet. They want the declaration to spread first, want other houses to have time to join them. He looked at his commander. How fast can we mobilize forces? 3 days, maybe 4 if we pull from the northern garrisons. Do it. Full mobilization. We end this fast and brutal before it has time to grow. They left the manor house as storm clouds gathered overhead. The ride back to the capital felt longer than it should have. Every shadow potentially hiding an ambush. Every sound potentially the beginning of the war they'd just declared. Darius rode in silence, turning over options in his mind. Military strategies, political calculations. the mathematics of violence that had defined his entire reign. But underneath it all was the creeping certainty that he'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade, that the empire was splitting in half, and the only way to hold it together was through blood. They reached the capital as dusk painted the sky crimson. Lyra met him in the throne room, took one look at his face, and knew. They refused. Worse, they declared rebellion. Darius moved to the eastern windows, staring out at the city. 3 territories. Maybe more by tomorrow. It's starting. How bad? Bad enough. We're mobilizing forces. We'll crush them before it spreads. But it's going to cost lives, resources, political capital we don't have. He turned to face her. This is what change costs. Not speeches or reforms. Blood. I know. Lyra's voice was quiet but steady. Did you expect anything different? I expected more time, more opportunity to build stability before testing it. He felt the exhaustion creeping in, the weight of 3 weeks of transformation crashing down all at once. We moved too fast. We moved at the speed survival required. If we'd gone slower, the corruption would have regrouped. The noble houses would have consolidated resistance. This was always going to be the price. Easy for you to say. Darius heard the bitterness in his own voice. You're not the one who has to send soldiers to kill wolves who were loyal until I forced them to choose. They were never loyal. Lyra moved closer. They were compliant. There's a difference. True loyalty doesn't collapse the moment you ask people to change. These houses were always going to fight. We just forced them to show their hand before they were ready. Darius wanted to argue. Couldn't find the angle. She was right, and he knew it. The door burst open. A messenger stumbled in, face pale, breathing hard. Your Majesty, news from the capital garrison. There's been an incident. What kind of incident? An explosion. The Western Armory, multiple casualties, and evidence of sabotage. The bottom dropped out of Darius's stomach. When? 20 minutes ago. The commander has locked down the district, but whoever set the charges is already gone. Sir, this wasn't random. The explosives were military grade. Someone on the inside. Darius and Lyra exchanged glances, the same thought occurring to both simultaneously. The rebellion isn't just in the eastern territories. It's here, in the capital, inside the palace. Get Thane, Darius snapped at the messenger. Full lockdown. No one enters or leaves the palace without my direct authorization. Search every room, question every guard. Find whoever did this before they strike again. The messenger fled. Darius turned to Lyra. You need to get to safety. If they're targeting infrastructure, they'll target leadership next. I'm not hiding, she said flatly. If this is sabotage, we need to know who's behind it. That means investigating, questioning people. I have relationships with guards and staff you don't. I can help. You can also die if a bomb goes off in the wrong corridor. So can you. Her eyes blazed. We do this together or we don't do it at all. Before Darius could argue, Thane appeared with a squad of guards. Your Majesty, we need you in the command center. We've identified the explosives. They match the signature from the coup attempt 3 weeks ago. The same people. Darius felt cold realization settling over him. The council's forces weren't defeated. They went underground, and they've been waiting for the right moment to strike again. Thane's jaw was tight. The armory explosion was a distraction. While we're investigating that, they'll hit somewhere else. Somewhere that matters more. Where would matter more than weapons? Lyra was thinking out loud. What's their objective? Kill the king? Destroy the assembly? Trigger chaos that forces martial law? All of the above, probably. Darius started toward the command center. But first they need to... The second explosion cut off his words. This one was closer, much closer. The entire palace shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Guards shouted. Alarms blared. Darius grabbed Lyra's arm. Move. Now. They ran through corridors filling with smoke. Guards appearing from side passages, trying to establish order, shouting contradictory reports about where the blast came from. The palace was chaos. Exactly what the saboteurs wanted. They reached the command center to find it already mobilized. Maps spread across tables. Officers barking orders. Thane coordinating the response with brutal efficiency. Report, Darius demanded. Eastern wing, records room, direct hit. Thane's face was grim. Sir, that's where we were keeping the evidence for the trials. All the documentation Lyra provided. The testimony, the financial records, everything. The implications crashed down like a hammer. They're destroying the proof, Lyra said quietly. Without the evidence, the trials can't proceed. Without the trials, the assembly loses credibility. Without credibility, the reforms collapse. Darius stared at the map, saw the red marks indicating blast sites, saw the pattern emerging. Systematic. Professional. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a coordinated assault on the entire reform structure. Can we recover anything from the records room? We're trying. Thane gestured to a team suiting up in protective gear, but preliminary reports suggest the fire is spreading. We might lose everything. There are copies, Lyra said suddenly. Clara has copies. In the Vale Guard quarters, not everything, but enough to rebuild the cases. Then get her to secure them immediately. Darius turned to Thane. I want every entrance to the palace sealed, every guard accounted for, every servant questioned. Someone inside is coordinating this, and I want them found. Sir, a young officer approached, holding a slip of paper. We found this near the Eastern Wing blast site. It was nailed to a support beam. Darius took the paper. Read the message scrawled in precise handwriting. The old empire will not die quietly. Neither will we. Every reform you build will tear down. Every ally you trust will turn. Every step you take toward change will counter with chaos. You cannot outrun what's coming. Signed, the True Council. Darius read it 3 times, then handed it to Lyra without comment. She read it. Her face went pale. They're not trying to stop the reforms, she said quietly. They're trying to make governance impossible, create so much instability that people beg for the old system back. Classic insurgency tactics. Thane was already adapting deployment strategies on the map. Attack soft targets, destroy infrastructure, erode confidence in the new leadership. Make the cost of change seem higher than the cost of submission. How many? Darius demanded. How many are we talking about? Is this the remnants of the Council's mercenaries or something bigger? Unknown. But coordinated explosions in 2 separate locations within 30 minutes suggests at least a dozen operatives. Maybe more. And they have inside help. Someone told them where the records were kept. Someone gave them access to restricted areas. The traitor is someone we trust. The words tasted like ash in Darius's mouth. Someone close enough to know our movements and plans. Or multiple someones. Lyra set down the message. The noble houses who've resisted the reforms. They have family members serving in the palace. Guards, administrators, people who've been loyal for years but whose primary loyalty is to their bloodlines, not to the throne. You're saying half my staff could be working against me. I'm saying we don't know who to trust anymore, which is exactly what they want. She looked at Darius. Fear and paranoia destroy governments faster than bombs. Then we don't give them the satisfaction. Darius straightened. Thane, implement strict protocols. No one moves alone. Every order gets verified through 2 separate channels. Critical operations require my personal authorization. Make it hard for saboteurs to operate. That will slow everything down, sir. Better slow than dead. He turned to Lyra. Get Clara and the backup evidence. Bring it here. We'll store it in the most secure vault we have and post guards who've been with me since before this started. People I know are loyal. There's no such thing as guaranteed loyalty, Lyra said quietly. Not anymore. But we do it anyway because we have to. She left with her guards. Darius watched her go and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 decades. Genuine uncertainty about whether he'd made the right choice. The old him would have crushed the reforms at the first sign of serious resistance, would have executed the council members publicly, would have ruled through fear and kept the empire intact through sheer overwhelming force. But that empire had been rotting. He'd known it even before Lyra walked into his throne room. The structure was failing, the system was breaking, and fear alone couldn't hold it together anymore. So he'd chosen change, chosen to burn it down and rebuild, chosen to give voice to wolves who'd been voiceless and power to those who'd been powerless. And now his capital was under attack. His evidence was destroyed. His territories were in rebellion. And somewhere inside his own palace, traitors were working to tear down everything he'd tried to build. The weight of it pressed down like a mountain. Your Majesty. Thane approached quietly. The guard rotations have been verified. We've identified 3 who have family connections to the rebel territories. They're being questioned now. Questioned or arrested. Both. We can't afford to assume innocence. No. Darius felt something hardening inside him, something familiar and cold and absolutely ruthless. We can't. Do what needs to be done. Thane nodded and left. Darius stood alone in the command center, staring at maps that showed an empire coming apart at the seams. Behind him, officers coordinated responses to threats they couldn't fully identify. Around him, the palace burned in places and held in others, a physical manifestation of everything they'd tried to become. And in his chest, underneath the exhaustion and the fury and the fear, Darius felt something that terrified him more than any external threat. Doubt. Not about whether the reforms were right. He still believed that, but doubt about whether they could survive long enough to matter. Doubt about whether change was possible when the forces against it were this organized and this ruthless. Doubt about whether he was strong enough to hold the empire together while simultaneously tearing apart everything that had held it together before. 3 decades he'd ruled without doubt, with absolute certainty in his strength and his methods and his right to command. Fear had been his weapon, and it had never failed him. But now the weapon was useless, and he was fighting a war with tools he'd never learned to use. Trust. Cooperation. The belief that people would choose loyalty over self-interest if given the chance. And he wasn't sure anymore if that belief was wisdom or fatal naivety. The third explosion came at midnight. This one killed 12 people, guards on the southern rampart. The blast tore through stone and flesh with equal efficiency, leaving a smoking crater where a defensive position had been. Darius stood at the site an hour later, looking at what remained. Bodies being removed, rubble cleared, the smell of burned meat and cordite thick enough to choke on. Thane appeared beside him. The interrogations yielded results. 2 of the guards with family connections to rebel territories confessed. They'd been passing information to operatives hiding in the city, locations of evidence storage, guard rotations, weak points in the palace defenses. Where are they now? The dungeons, awaiting your judgment. Darius said nothing for a long moment, just stared at the crater, at the blood soaking into ancient stone, at the cost of trying to build something new. Execute them, he said finally, publicly. At dawn, make sure every wolf in this palace understands what happens to traitors. Sir, if we execute them without trial, we undermine the justice system we're trying to build. If we don't execute them, we show weakness. And weakness right now gets more people killed. Darius turned to face his commander. I know what it costs. Do it anyway. Thane hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. He left. Darius remained at the blast site, feeling the old familiar weight of absolute power settling back onto his shoulders like a cloak he'd tried to shed but couldn't quite escape. Footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. You heard, he said to Lyra. I heard. She moved to stand beside him. You're going back, to the old methods. I'm doing what survival requires. That's what tyrants always say. The words hit like a physical blow. Darius turned to face her, anger flaring hot and immediate. I'm trying to hold an empire together while enemies attack from outside and inside simultaneously. Don't lecture me about methods when you're not the one making impossible choices. Every choice is impossible right now. Lyra's voice stayed level. That doesn't make execution without trial the right one. You execute those guards, you prove the rebels were right, that the reforms were a facade, that when pressure hits, you revert to the monster everyone feared. And if I don't execute them, I prove I'm weak, that treason can be survived, that the empire has gone soft. Either way, I lose. Then lose in the direction of what you're trying to build instead of what you're trying to escape. She stepped closer. You told those noble houses that change requires choosing the hard path. This is the hard path. Holding to your principles when everything's on fire. That's what separates reform from revenge. Principles don't stop bombs. Principles don't prevent rebellions. Darius could feel himself standing at a precipice. One path led back to everything he'd been. Brutal. Efficient. Ruling through fear because fear worked. The other path led deeper into uncertainty and risk, and the possibility that he'd destroy the empire trying to save it. What do you want from me, Lyra? What do you actually want? I want you to be better than you were. Her eyes held his. Because if you're not, then what was the point of any of this? We burned down the old system just to rebuild it with you still as the monster at the center. That's not transformation. That's just rebranding. The words hung between them like an accusation. Darius wanted to argue, to defend his choice, to explain that survival required sacrifice and sometimes you had to become the monster to protect what mattered. But looking at Lyra standing there in the ruins of his failed reforms, he couldn't find the words. Because she was right, and that realization felt like dying. The dawn execution never happened. Darius countermanded the order at 4 in the morning, told Thane the guards would face trial like everyone else, would be judged by the system they'd tried to undermine, and if found guilty, would face punishment under the new laws, not the old methods. Thane accepted the change without comment, but Darius could see the concern in his commander's eyes, the worry that mercy was being confused with weakness at exactly the wrong moment. Maybe it was. The assembly convened an emergency session that afternoon. The hall was tense, every representative aware that the empire was fracturing and that their words here might determine whether it held together or collapsed entirely. Lyra stood to address them. Her voice carried weight despite the exhaustion obvious in every line of her body. We face coordinated attacks from forces that want the old system restored. They've destroyed evidence, killed guards, triggered rebellions in the Eastern Territories, and they've succeeded in making us doubt each other. That was their goal. To prove that change is too costly, that the empire can only function through fear and absolute control. We can prove them wrong, or we can prove them right. The choice is ours. How do you suggest we prove them wrong? Lord Brethen's nephew demanded. He'd taken his uncle's seat after the declaration of rebellion. The forces arrayed against us are substantial. Our resources are divided. Our evidence is gone. What exactly do we build this victory on? Truth. Lyra gestured to Clara, who stepped forward with sealed documents. The backup evidence has been secured. We've also gathered new testimony from victims of the slave trade operations, and we've identified connections between the saboteurs and specific noble houses. The information still exists. The truth still exists. We just have to be brave enough to act on it. Acting on truth doesn't stop armies, someone shouted. No, but it gives people a reason to fight that's stronger than fear. Lyra's gaze swept the hall. Every wolf who stood on those walls 3 weeks ago chose to defend this empire, not because they were forced to, but because they believed it could be better. That belief is worth more than 1,000 soldiers who fight only because they're afraid of punishment. The debate raged for hours. Representatives arguing strategy and philosophy and the practical realities of warfare against entrenched resistance. By the end, they'd reached a decision. The trials would proceed as planned. The military campaign against the rebel territories would launch in 2 days, and the assembly would remain in session to coordinate relief efforts for districts damaged by sabotage. It was a compromise. Not perfect, but functional. As the representatives filed out, Darius remained seated on his throne, watching Lyra coordinate with various officials, seeing her in her element, fierce and intelligent and absolutely committed to making this impossible situation work. She'd changed him. That was undeniable. Forced him to question methods he'd relied on for 3 decades. Made him see that ruling through fear alone was slowly killing the thing he'd spent his life protecting. But the cost of that change was still being calculated. In bodies. In burned buildings. In territories declaring rebellion because they'd rather fight than accept a new order. And Darius wasn't sure anymore if the cost was worth the potential reward. That night, he found himself back on the eastern balcony. Same view he'd shared with Lyra weeks ago. The city spread below, lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. Thane joined him quietly. Sir, we finalized deployment strategies for the Eastern campaign. 3 columns. Converging assault. We'll hit all 3 rebel territories simultaneously and crush resistance before they can coordinate a defense. Timeline. 4 weeks from initial engagement to total victory. Assuming no complications. Darius nodded, felt the familiar rhythms of war planning settling into place. This he understood. Military strategy, clear objectives, measurable outcomes. Not like the messy uncertainty of governance and reform and trying to change an empire from the inside while enemies attacked from every direction. One more thing, Thane said carefully. The rebel territories have sent a message. Final offer. They'll cease hostilities and acknowledge assembly authority if you remove Lyra Vale as first speaker and replace her with a noble-born representative. Darius went very still. And if I refuse? They fight to the last wolf. Total war. They'll burn their own territories before they accept Omega governance. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. Keep Lyra and fight a war that would cost thousands of lives and decades of instability. Or remove her and salvage some version of the reforms while appeasing the noble houses enough to prevent total collapse. It was the same impossible calculation he'd been making for weeks. Principle versus survival. The future he wanted versus the empire he had. And standing there on the balcony looking out at his fractured domain, Darius finally understood the full weight of what he'd attempted. You couldn't rule through fear and reform simultaneously. Couldn't maintain absolute control while empowering the previously powerless. Couldn't be the monster and the savior at the same time. He'd tried to split the difference. Tried to transform the empire while keeping enough of the old structure intact to prevent chaos. But the empire demanded a choice. All in or nothing. Transform completely or preserve what remained. And he didn't know which path led to survival. Tell the rebel territories we'll respond to their offer within 24 hours, Darius said finally. And call an emergency council. Me, Lyra, you, and the senior assembly representatives. Dawn tomorrow. We need to make a decision. What kind of decision? Thane asked quietly. The kind that determines what this empire becomes. Darius turned from the view, or if it survives at all. He walked back inside, leaving Thane on the balcony, leaving the question hanging in the cold night air. The empire was burning, and Darius Vane had to choose between the person who'd shown him a better path and the structures that had kept his world from collapsing for 30 years. There was no right answer. There was only the choice itself, and the knowledge that whatever he decided would determine not just the fate of the empire, but the definition of who he'd become in his desperate attempt to be something more than the monster everyone had needed him to be. Dawn came cold and merciless, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. Darius stood alone in his chambers, staring at his reflection in the polished steel of his armor. The face looking back was the same one that had terrified an empire for 30 years. Same brutal angles, same winter-gray eyes, same scar running temple to jaw like a reminder that he'd survived things that should have killed him. But something underneath had shifted. Some fundamental assumption about what power meant and what it cost to wield it properly. He'd spent the night weighing options, running calculations, trying to find an angle that preserved both the reforms and the empire. Every path led to the same impossible conclusion. He couldn't have both. The noble houses had made that clear. Keep Lyra and watch the empire tear itself apart in civil war. Remove her and salvage some version of change while proving that when pressure mounted, the old structures still controlled everything that mattered. There was no middle ground left. The emergency council convened in the war room as pale light filtered through arrow-slit windows. Lyra arrived first, Clara beside her, both looking like they'd spent the night preparing for exactly this conversation. Thane entered with senior military advisors, maps already unfurled, deployment strategies marked in red across territories that had been loyal a month ago. The assembly representatives came last. A mix of common wolves and minor nobles who'd thrown their support behind the reforms because they believed change was possible. They filled the room with the nervous energy of people who understood their entire future was about to be decided by words spoken in the next hour. Darius remained standing at the head of the table. Didn't sit. Didn't soften his posture. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a judgment, and he was judge, jury, and executioner all at once. The rebel territories sent their final terms, he said without preamble. They'll cease hostilities if I remove Lyra Vale as first speaker and replace her with noble-born representation. If I refuse, they fight until every last wolf is dead or we crush them completely. The room went silent. Every person there understanding what hung in the balance. What's the military assessment if we refuse? One of the assembly representatives asked quietly. Thane stepped forward. 4 weeks minimum to defeat organized resistance in 3 fortified territories. Casualties estimated at 2,000 on our side, 4,000 on theirs. Civilian losses difficult to predict but substantial. And that's assuming no other territories join the rebellion while we're engaged. And if they do join, timeline extends to 3 months. Casualties triple. And we risk triggering a cascade where half the empire fractures into independent factions that take years to bring back under control. He paused. We're talking about the potential collapse of everything we've built over 3 centuries. The weight of those numbers settled over the room like a shroud. Lyra spoke into the silence. And if Darius accepts their terms, if he removes me and installs a noble as first speaker, what then? Then the reforms continue in name but not in substance. another representative said bitterly. The assembly becomes a facade. Power returns to the bloodlines. Everything we fought for gets watered down until it's meaningless. Not meaningless, someone else argued. Diminished, maybe. But we'd still have representation, still have trials, still have some version of justice. That's better than civil war. Is it? Lyra asked quietly. Is survival without real change better than fighting for something that matters? Spoken like someone who doesn't have to send soldiers to die, Lord Kaelin's cousin snapped. He'd taken a seat in the assembly after refusing to join the rebellion. Easy to stand on principle when you're not the one counting bodies. I've counted plenty of bodies. Lyra's voice went cold. I spent 8 years in territories you people ignored, burying Omegas who died in your mines and your fields and your wars. Don't lecture me about the cost of principle. I know exactly what it weighs. Then you know we can't afford it right now, the representative shot back. We're outmanned, outpositioned, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who have nothing to lose. Accepting their terms isn't surrender, it's pragmatism. It's capitulation, someone else argued. It's proving the rebels were right, that fear still controls everything, that the moment things get difficult, we revert to the old hierarchy. The debate escalated, voices rising, arguments becoming accusations, the room fracturing along the same fault lines that ran through the entire empire. Darius let them fight, let them expose every angle and fear and desperate hope. Leadership was about understanding all the perspectives before making the choice that satisfied none of them. When the arguing reached its peak, he raised one hand. Silence fell immediately. That particular reflex ran deep. 3 decades of conditioning that when the Iron King moved, you stopped talking and started listening. I've heard the arguments, Darius said quietly. Military necessity versus moral principle. Pragmatic survival versus idealistic transformation. Both sides make sense. Both sides are right in their own way. But this isn't about what makes sense. It's about what we're willing to die for. He turned to look at Lyra, met those forest green eyes that had challenged him from the first moment she walked into his throne room. The rebel territories want me to remove you because you're dangerous. Not militarily, not politically. You're dangerous because you represent the idea that power doesn't come from bloodline or fear. That an Omega from nowhere can sit at the table with alphas who've ruled for generations and demand they justify their authority. That terrifies them more than any army I could field. Lyra held his gaze. Didn't speak. Just waited. If I remove you now, Darius continued, I prove them right. I prove that when survival is threatened, the Empire will always choose preservation over transformation. That fear is still the foundation everything rests on. And every common wolf who fought on those walls, who believed change was real, learns that their loyalty means nothing compared to noble demands. So you refuse their terms, Thane said carefully. Darius turned to his commander. I refuse to let 3 rebel territories dictate the future of an empire that survived longer than their bloodlines have existed. If they want war, we give them war. Fast, brutal, overwhelming. We hit all 3 territories simultaneously, crush their leadership, and show every noble house in this empire that rebellion isn't pragmatic. It's suicide. Sir, the casualties will be high. I know. Darius's voice carried the weight of every death he'd ordered over 30 years. Every execution, every battle, every choice that saved some lives by ending others. But the casualties of backing down are higher. We lose the reforms, we lose credibility, and we teach every dissatisfied faction that threatening violence is how you get what you want. That's a lesson I won't give them. He looked around the room, saw the fear, the hope, the desperate calculation happening behind every pair of eyes. This is the moment we decide what this empire actually is. Whether we're building something new or just rearranging the same old hierarchy under different names. I'm choosing new. I'm choosing the hard path. And anyone who can't walk it with me can leave right now with no consequences. No one moved. Then we mobilize at noon. Darius gestured to the maps. 3 columns like Thane suggested. Coordinated assault. We end this in 4 weeks or we die trying. Assembly representatives, you coordinate civilian protection and supply lines. Military command, you focus on strategy and execution. And Lyra, he paused, you keep the assembly functioning, keep the reforms alive. Because if we're going to war to defend them, they better be worth defending. Lyra's expression was unreadable. You're gambling everything on this. I'm gambling on what we've already built being strong enough to survive being tested. Darius held her gaze. Was I wrong to believe that? A slow smile curved her lips, that cold, knowing expression he'd come to recognize as her tell that she approved even when the odds looked impossible. No, you weren't wrong. The council broke. Representatives scattering to their duties. Military command moving to deployment stations. The machinery of war grinding into motion with the terrible efficiency of something that had been refined over centuries. Darius caught Lyra before she could leave, pulled her aside to a corner where the noise was distant and the shadows deep. If this goes badly, he said quietly, if we lose or if I die out there, you take Clara and anyone loyal and you run, back to the Vale. Somewhere they can't find you. Don't try to hold the capital. Don't make a last stand. Just survive. We're not losing, Lyra said firmly. But if we do, we're not. She stepped closer. You made your choice. You chose the future over the past. You chose loyalty over fear. That's worth fighting for. That's worth dying for if it comes to that. But we're not dying. We're winning. And when we do, this empire becomes something it's never been before. What's that? Worth the loyalty people give it? She held his eyes, instead of just demanding it through terror. For a moment they stood there in the shadows, two people who'd been enemies a month ago and were now bound together by something that felt dangerously close to trust, maybe even something deeper that neither of them had time to examine. Then Lyra stepped back, returned to the controlled distance that politics and survival required. Don't get killed out there, King Vane. I'd hate to rebuild this empire without someone to argue with. Don't let it fall apart while I'm gone, Queen Vale. I'd hate to come back to ruins after winning the war. She smiled. Then she was gone. Guards following, leaving Darius alone with the weight of what he'd just committed to. 3 territories. Coordinated assault. 4 weeks of brutal warfare to decide whether change was possible or just a fantasy that collapsed under pressure. He'd made harder choices, led bloodier campaigns, survived worse odds. But this time felt different. This time he was fighting not just for territory or power, but for the idea that an empire could transform without destroying itself in the process. And he wasn't sure anymore if that idea was noble or just naive dressed up as principle. The armies mobilized with mechanical precision. 3 columns assembling in the marshalling yard south of the capital. 2,000 soldiers in total, drawn from loyal garrisons and supplemented by volunteers from the common wolves who'd fought during the coup attempt. They weren't professional soldiers, but they were fierce in the way people got when they were defending something they'd helped build. Darius rode along the lines, reviewing troops, his presence alone enough to straighten spines and harden resolve. Some of these wolves would die in the coming weeks. That was inevitable. The mathematics of war were brutal and unforgiving, but they'd die for something that mattered. That was the difference between ruling through fear and earning loyalty. At least that's what he told himself. Thane approached as the final equipment checks were being completed. Sir, scouts report the rebel territories have consolidated their forces. They're not defending all 3 locations. They've pulled back to Ironwood. Everything they have concentrated in one position. Smart. Darius studied the revised map his commander carried. They know they can't hold 3 territories against coordinated assault, so they make us come to them on ground they control, force a single decisive battle instead of letting us grind them down piecemeal. It's a trap, Thane said flatly. Fortified position, prepared defenses. They'll have every advantage. I know. Darius traced the terrain around Ironwood with one finger. But it's also an opportunity. If we break them there, we break the entire rebellion at once. No prolonged campaign, no multiple engagements. One battle decides everything. Sir, the casualties will be what they have to be. He looked at Thane. I'm not asking you to like this. I'm asking if you can execute it. Thane's jaw tightened. Then he nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. Good. We march in 2 hours, full speed to Ironwood. We hit them before they can finish their preparations. He paused. And Thane, if I fall during this, you pull back. Don't try to hold ground or make a heroic last stand. Get the survivors to safety and let Lyra decide what comes next. You're not going to fall, sir. I've survived 30 years by planning for the possibility. This is no different. The march to Ironwood took 3 days of hard travel. They moved fast, sleeping little, pushing through terrain that got rougher as they approached the rebel territory. Scouts reported back regularly. The enemy was dug in. Fortifications strengthened. artillery positioned on high ground, every tactical advantage being exploited by commanders who understood defensive warfare. On the third night, Darius stood in his command tent staring at maps that looked increasingly grim. The rebel position was stronger than intelligence had suggested. Taking it would cost hundreds of lives, maybe more. A commotion outside, guards challenging someone. Then Lyra's voice cutting through the objections. She walked into the tent like she owned it, Clara and 2 guards behind her, all of them travel-worn and dust-covered. "What are you doing here?" Darius demanded. "Coming to make sure you don't get killed doing something heroically stupid?" Lyra moved to the map table without invitation. "I brought something you need. I need you in the capital keeping the assembly functioning." "The assembly is functioning. Clara's managing it. I'm more useful here." She gestured to one of her guards, who produced a sealed document case. "Intelligence from inside Ironwood. We have sympathizers in the rebel territories, people who don't support this war. They've provided detailed information on defensive positions, supply caches, and command structure." Darius opened the case, studied the documents inside. His eyes widened fractionally. "This is current. Updated within the last day. We have runners, people who believe in what we're building more than they fear their local alphas." Lyra pointed to markings on a secondary map. "The main fortifications are here and here, but there's a weakness. The eastern approach. It's lightly defended because the terrain is considered impassable for large forces." "It is impassable." Thane had joined them. "I know that region. Narrow passes, steep grades, perfect place for an ambush. For a conventional force, yes." Lyra looked at Darius. "But a small strike team could navigate it. Hit the command post from an unexpected direction while the main force engages their fortifications. You've done this before. During the northern campaigns 15 years ago." Darius studied the map, saw the angle, the risk, the potential reward. A strike team meant 50 soldiers maximum, moving through hostile territory with no support. If they failed, if they were discovered or ambushed, they died, and the main assault lost its tactical advantage. But if it worked, they'd decapitate the rebel leadership and collapse the entire defensive structure from within. It was exactly the kind of brutal, pragmatic gamble he'd built his reputation on. "Who provided this intelligence?" he asked quietly. "People who want to live in an empire that doesn't treat them as expendable." Lyra's voice was steady. "People who believe you when you say change is real. That's who. And if it's a trap, then we die. But it's not. I vetted the sources personally." Lyra met his eyes. "I'm putting my life behind this intelligence, literally, because I'm going with the strike team." "Absolutely not," Darius said immediately. "Absolutely yes. You need someone who knows the territory, someone the sympathizers trust enough to provide real-time updates if conditions change." "That's me. You're the first speaker. You're the symbol of everything we're fighting for. If you die, the entire reform movement collapses. If we lose this battle, it collapses anyway." She stepped closer. "You made your choice to fight for the future. Let me make mine to fight beside you." Or was all that talk about equal representation just performance for the nobles? The words hit like arrows, finding gaps in armor. Darius wanted to argue, to pull rank, to protect her the way 30 years of instinct screamed he should protect anything valuable enough to lose. But she was right. If Omegas were equals, they got to fight and die as equals. Anything less was the old hierarchy wearing new clothes. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "You're on the strike team, but you follow orders, no improvisation, no heroics." "Clear, crystal." Lyra smiled that cold smile. "Now brief me on the actual plan so I know what orders I'm following." They worked through the night, refining strategy, identifying weak points. The strike team would be 50 soldiers, all volunteers, all understanding this was likely a one-way mission. They'd move at dawn, navigating the eastern passes while the main force engaged the fortifications. If the strike team succeeded, the rebel leadership died and the defenses collapsed. If they failed, the main force would grind forward anyway and win through sheer bloody attrition. Either way, the war ended at Ironwood. Darius addressed the strike team volunteers as false dawn touched the sky. They stood in loose formation, faces hard, hands never far from weapons. These were the wolves who'd proven themselves during the coup attempt, who'd held walls and fought in burning streets and learned they were more than their bloodlines said they could be. This is a suicide mission, Darius said bluntly. No point softening it. No one survives by pretending death isn't waiting at the other end of bad terrain. We're going through passes that would kill us even without enemies waiting. We're hitting a fortified position from an unexpected angle with no reinforcements and no escape route. Most of us won't come back. He let that settle, saw it register in their expressions. The fear, the determination, the acceptance. But if we succeed, this war ends today, not in 4 weeks. Today, the rebel leadership dies, their defenses collapse, and we prove that loyalty and courage matter more than bloodline and fear. That's what you're fighting for, not territory, not glory. The idea that an Omega and an Alpha can stand side by side and bleed for the same cause. He paused. Anyone who wants out, leave now. No shame, no consequences. This is volunteer only. No one moved. Then let's go kill some traitors. They moved out as the sun broke over distant mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The terrain was every bit as brutal as promised. Narrow passes that forced them into single file. Steep climbs that left everyone gasping. Loose scree that turned every step into a potential fall. But they made progress. Slow, careful, professional. Lyra moved near the front with Darius and Thane, navigating with the confidence of someone who'd spent years in mountain territory. She'd been right about knowing the terrain. Her guidance kept them from 2 dead ends and 1 pass that would have cost lives to bad footing. By midday they were in position, a ridgeline overlooking Ironwood's command post. Below them, the fortified manor house that served as rebel headquarters. Guards visible at every entrance, artillery positioned to cover approaches, the entire structure designed to withstand siege. But they'd designed for attacks from the front, not from above. Darius studied the position through a spyglass, counted guards, marked patrol patterns. The command post was heavily defended but not impregnable. A fast, brutal assault could take it before reinforcements arrived, if everything went perfectly, if no one made mistakes, if luck favored them even slightly. A lot of ifs for a plan that required absolute precision. He gathered the strike team leaders, laid out final assignments. Who hit which entrance? Who secured which corridor? Who went after the leadership while others held the perimeter? Then he looked at Lyra. You stay with the reserve team. Once the command post is secured, you come in. Not before. I'm not sitting on a ridge while everyone else fights, she said flatly. You're the most valuable person here. If you die, the entire political structure we built collapses. So you stay back until it's safe. Nothing about this is safe. She met his eyes. And I didn't come all this way to watch from the sidelines. I'm going in with the first wave. Lyra? No. Her voice was steel. You chose to fight for equality. That means Omegas fight when it matters. That means I don't get protected like I'm fragile while everyone else bleeds. Either we're equals or we're not. Choose. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Darius wanted to argue, to protect her, to keep her safe because losing her would cost more than just 1 life. But she was right. Again. If Omegas were equals, they earned it through the same risks everyone else took. Fine, he said quietly. You're with my team. We go through the main entrance, but you stay behind me, and if I say run, you run. Understood? Understood. Lyra checked her bow. Though if you say run, things have already gone very wrong. Things are always wrong in combat. The trick is deciding how wrong is too wrong. He looked at the assembled strike team. On my signal, fast, brutal, no mercy. These wolves tried to destroy everything we built. We returned the favor. The assault began with controlled chaos. 50 wolves pouring down the ridge like an avalanche, hitting the command post from angles the defenders didn't expect. Arrows first, taking down sentries. Then close combat as strike teams breached entrances simultaneously. Darius led his team through the main door, his sword already moving, taking down the first guard before the man could raise an alarm. Behind him, wolves poured through the gap, securing the entrance hall with brutal efficiency. Inside was tight corridor fighting, the kind of combat that came down to reflexes and who hesitated first. Darius didn't hesitate. Never had. He moved through the manor house like a force of nature, killing with the same cold efficiency he'd perfected over 3 decades. Defenders fell, rooms cleared. The strike team pushed deeper. Lyra stayed close, her bow singing in tight confines. putting arrows through throats and eyes with accuracy that would have impressed him if he'd had time to notice. She moved like she'd been born to this. No hesitation, no fear, just absolute focus on the objective. They reached the central chamber to find it barricaded. Heavy furniture stacked against doors, defenders with crossbows waiting, a position that would cost lives to take by force. Thane appeared beside Darius. "Sir, we're locked down in the east wing. Heavy resistance. We need—" The explosion cut off his words. Not from their position, from outside. The main battle had begun. The Imperial forces engaging the rebel fortifications, artillery fire shaking the ground, the sound of thousands of wolves crashing against prepared defenses. "We're out of time," Darius said. "The rebels know we're here. They'll reinforce this position. We take it now or we lose the advantage." "How?" Thane demanded. "That door is reinforced. We'd need—" "Fire." Lyra pointed to tapestries on the walls, oil lamps, wooden furniture. "Burn them out." "They'll die," one of the strike team said. "They're traitors who tried to destroy the Empire." Lyra's voice was flat. "I'm not shedding tears." Darius studied the barricaded door. Thought about the wolves behind it, Lord Brethan, Lord Kaelin, Lady Serath, the ones who'd chosen rebellion over reform, who'd put their bloodlines above the Empire's survival. He could burn them out, could end this quickly, could win through the same brutal methods he'd always used, or he could try one more time to offer them a choice. The old Darius wouldn't have hesitated, would have set the fire and watched them burn and called it justice. But something had changed. Some fundamental shift in how he calculated the cost of victory. "Hold positions," he ordered. Then he raised his voice to carry through the barricaded door. "Brethan, I know you're in there. Come out. Surrender. Face trial. You'll get justice under the system you tried to destroy." Silence from beyond the door. Then Brethan's voice, muffled but clear. "Justice from a system that gives Omegas equal voice? That's not justice. That's the end of everything our family's built." "Your families built their wealth on exploitation," Lyra called out, "on slaves and stolen territory and centuries of crushing anyone who couldn't fight back. That's the legacy you're defending. Better than watching everything we are get diluted by wolves who've done nothing to earn power." Brethan's contempt carried through the barrier. "You can kill us. You probably will, but you'll never make us accept this abomination you call progress." Darius felt something cold settle into his chest. The understanding that some people couldn't be convinced, couldn't be reformed, could only be stopped. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Surrender and live. Or stay behind that door and burn." The response was a crossbow bolt punching through a gap in the barricade. It caught one of Darius's guards in the shoulder, spinning the man around. Darius looked at Lyra, at Thane, at the strike team waiting for orders. "Burn it," he said flatly. The fire started fast. Oil from lamps splashed on furniture, tapestries serving as kindling. Within minutes, the heat was intense, smoke filling the corridor, and from behind the barricade, coughing, shouting, the first edge of panic. "They'll come out," Thane said. "No one stays in fire by choice." They did come out, but not surrendering. They came out fighting with the desperate violence of people who'd run out of options. 20 rebel soldiers and the 3 Alpha Lords who'd led them, weapons drawn, eyes wild. The fighting was savage, tight confines, smoke and flames making everything chaos. Darius met Lord Kaelin's charge with his sword, catching the younger Alpha's blade and turning it aside. Kaelin was good, trained, powerful. He pressed forward with the kind of aggressive assault that might have worked against someone less experienced. But Darius had been killing people since before Kaelin was born. He let the younger wolf overextend, then struck. One brutal, efficient move that opened Kaelin from collar to hip. The rebel Alpha fell without a sound. Lady Serath died next, trying to break through to the exit. She made it maybe 3 steps before multiple blades found her. Professional, efficient. No hesitation from soldiers who'd learned that mercy got you killed. Lord Brethan was last. The old Alpha fought with the kind of desperation that came from knowing death was inevitable. He killed 2 strike team members before Thane disarmed him, broke the old wolf's sword hand, put him on his knees in the smoke and flames. Darius approached slowly, looked down at the Alpha who'd led this rebellion, who'd chosen his bloodline over the Empire's survival. "Any last words?" he asked quietly. Brethan looked up. blood running from a dozen wounds, eyes full of hate, and something that might have been resignation. History will judge you a fool for what you've done here, for what you've thrown away. History is written by survivors. Darius raised his sword, and you won't be one of them. The blade fell. The rebellion's leadership ended, and in the burning manor house surrounded by the dead, Darius Vane stood over the bodies and felt nothing except tired. Outside, the sounds of battle were shifting, the defenders losing cohesion, artillery falling silent, the coordinated defense collapsing into chaos as word spread that the leadership was dead. The strike team secured what remained of the command post. Found intelligence, maps, letters proving connections to other noble houses who'd been considering joining the rebellion, evidence of a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone had known. "We need to get this back to the capital," Thane said, organizing the documents. "This proves the rot went farther than just 3 territories." Darius nodded. Then he looked around for Lyra. Didn't see her. Fear, sharp and immediate, cut through his exhaustion. "Where's the first speaker?" "She went to secure the eastern wing," one of the soldiers said, "right after the main assault, with a squad to clear remaining defenders." Darius was moving before conscious thought, through smoke-filled corridors, over bodies, following the sound of fighting that still echoed from deeper in the manor. He found her in a side chamber, surrounded by 5 enemy soldiers, her guards down, her bow broken, a knife in her hand and blood running from a cut along her ribs. She was still fighting. Darius hit the enemy's soldiers like a collapsing wall, killed 3 in the first 5 seconds. The remaining 2 turned to face him, realized their mistake, tried to disengage, died before they completed the thought. Then it was just Darius and Lyra in a room full of corpses. She was breathing hard, pale from blood loss, but her eyes were clear. "I had it under control," she said. "You're bleeding. I'm alive." She looked at the bodies around them, which is more than they can say. Darius crossed to her, examined the wound, deep enough to need stitches but not life-threatening if treated quickly. Relief and fury warred in his chest in equal measure. "You said you'd follow orders." Staying with the main group was an order. Securing the wing was necessary. She met his eyes without apology. "I made a judgment call. Your judgment almost got you killed. But it didn't." She smiled that cold smile. "And now the eastern wing is secure. You're welcome." For a moment they stood there surrounded by death and smoke and the smell of burning wood. 2 people who'd started as enemies and become something else through necessity and violence, and the brutal shared experience of building something that kept trying to kill them. Then Lyra swayed slightly, blood loss catching up with exhaustion. Darius caught her before she fell, lifted her with the ease of someone who'd carried wounded soldiers off a dozen battlefields. "Put me down," she muttered. "I can walk." "Shut up and conserve your strength. That's an order, is it?" "Yes." "Fine." She settled against his chest, "but only because I'm bleeding, not because I need protecting."